but hopefully the guest at some point will come in. Audience, we're waiting for Dr. E. James West, who is a, let's call up his bio, who is a uh, lecturer at modern U.S. history at the University of York in the UK. He is co-director of the Black Press Research Collective, which is based at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore. His work focuses primarily on histories of the Black press and Black Chicago. Now, this guy not only wrote one book on Lerone Bennett, Dr. Ball, but he wrote two.
Right.
And he did something that I've never seen a Black press historian do. He actually wrote a book on the history of the Black press in Chicago from the point of view of architecture. Because of the
Mm.
very historic buildings, like the Chicago Defender had a very historic building that they had since like the 1930s, and everybody from Du Bois and everybody had gone through that building. In fact, I met Lerone Bennett in that building, in the courtyard of that building. So it was a fantastic experience for me. But he also talks about, the fact that Ebony had this big building on, a front street. And Johnson in his autobiography talks about the importance of having a building on a front street in Chicago. So this guy, Dr. West, has done all of this amazing work on Black press history, and we hope to have him join us. But if he doesn't join us, we're going to talk about Clark and Bennett and Turner,
And
and
you've at
and
least
mention
read
his
the book.
books.
Yeah, and you've at least read the
I read both
book in
books.
question here, which is,
Right,
well, both books, of
right,
course you have.
right.
So, but our kind of historian, the work and activism of Lerone Bennett Jr. by E. James West, just so folks get a clear understanding of what we're talking about here. But as the preeminent Black press historian that I'm aware of, and having read the work, I know you're quite capable of leading this discussion. So as we await our guest, if he shows up, great. If not, we'll do what we do and have fun with it. So where do you want us to start? Let's go ahead and get
Well,
started.
let me start with mentioning his other book. It's called Ebony
Mm-hmm.
Magazine and Lerone Bennett Jr.
Mm.
Popular Black History in Post-War America. So our kind of historian is the political biography of Bennett. But the book that's called Ebony Magazine and Lerone Bennett Jr., Popular Black History in Post-War America, that book is about Lerone Bennett and Ebony's relationship to Black history and Black historiography. And Dr. Ball, I have to thank you, because when I wrote an article about the book on Ebony Magazine and Lerone Bennett, I wrote this long article for you over a year ago. And as a result of that article, I got included in a documentary on Ebony Magazine
Mm.
that's going to be coming out, I'm assuming, this year. So I wanted to thank you for that. And by the way, audience, it's one of the best articles I've ever written, I got to be honest. And it's called The Revolution on Your Mama's Coffee Table. Lerone Bennett and something, something, something. It's on our Mix What I Like from February. I think it was February of 2020 or February from 2021, one of those Februarys. But it's one of my favorite articles, and it discusses that particular book in the context of Bennett's life. So I do my own riff on Bennett's life from the perspective of that book. So that was before I got this biography by West.
Right.
And I really appreciate West's work. I mean, he clearly had some grants and did some major archival work in the United States, because anybody who comes back, from America with enough material for 3 books, right, I have to definitely respect. West, to give you kind of an idea of how he writes, West understands he's a white guy from England, so he doesn't try to go deep into the kind of cultural context. He goes into the factual context, which was important to me because I always wanted to know things about Bennett. And thanks to his factual approach, I can now make my own assumptions about Bennett, which allows me to, because I have questions, and a good book, either answers questions or it gives you the tools to answer the questions that you have about a person, a place, or a thing, right?
Mm.
So let's talk about the secret to Lerone Bennett first. There it is. There's one of my
Yeah,
favorite
I'm just
articles.
sharing. Yeah, and I'm
Thank
putting
you,
the link in the chat. I'll put it in the show description as well when we're finished, but just
thank
so
thank you
people
so
get
much.
an idea. Yeah.
Thank you so much. So let's talk about the secret of Lerone Bennett, and then maybe we can throw in Clark and Turner, their secrets, right? And then maybe we can just do a kind of a journey where we go through all three of these men, right?
All right.
So what's the secret of Lerone Bennett? How did this guy become a historian and an activist and a Pan-Africanist, but still at the same time work for this bloodsucker black capitalist, right, by the name of John H. Johnson, right, who's so contradictory. I mean, Dr. Ball has a book out slamming him, 8 Ways to
It doesn't
Sunday.
slam him. It doesn't slam him.
Yes,
It
yes,
does not slam him. It makes one point, and it borrows heavily from the work of Dr. Jonathan Fenderson, another Turnerite,
absolutely.
who has an essay in this book edited by Scott Brown. And Fenderson is one of those sharp younger lions in the Africana world. But no, it does not slam him. But anyway, go ahead, man.
No, I'm sorry, Dr. Ball. I'm sorry. Let me be more. Let me be more scholarly. Dr. Ball gives a very strong critique of how Johnson created the myth of black buying power for his own purposes, right? But
Mhm.
Johnson has been appropriately slammed for all the things he did, with the ads, with the skin lighteners and all of this, and even Ebony's
Mhm.
kind of focus, which is basically the manifestation of E. Franklin Frazier's black bourgeoisie, right?
Mhm.
So Johnson deserves to be slammed. Okay, I have difficult. Dr. Ball knows this. I have difficulty slamming John H. Johnson because Dr. Ball studies media as systems. I study media as stories, and all of my favorite stories about the black press, this is probably my favorite. Like if there was somebody that I could be in the 20th century, it would be Lerone Bennett. I mean, I just have so I have a very emotional attachment to Bennett. So I tend to excuse Johnson because to me, when people say, "Well, who's Johnny Johnson?" I always define him as, "Oh, you mean that guy who hired three Pan-Africanists and hired uh, um, Peter Bailey? You mean that guy, right?" I
I
mean, and
mean,
that
that's part of the contradiction that Fenderson talks about. I mean, Fenderson's
right,
book is about Hoyt Fuller,
right,
the much more nationalist Pan Africanist Hoyt Fuller, who
right,
is hired at one point by John H. Johnson. Now, it could be argued, depending on how you read Fenderson, why he hired him.
right, right,
To maybe cloak himself,
right,
man
right,
can manifesto himself,
right.
but he did it.
No, Johnson has very complicated calculi in terms of what he's trying to do. But I wanted to know about Bennett. I wanted to know, why would a Pan Africanist work for this guy, right? And thanks to West, I know the answer. So let me tell you the answer. Now, admittedly, this is reductive, okay? But it's what I got from the reading, my extrapolation of West facts. So West does not say this. I'm saying this. Reading the
Mhm.
book of West facts. The reason Bennett is how he is and he stays with Johnson is because he's bougie. It's not complicated. And not only is he bougie, now I'm about to really get in trouble now. Not only is he bougie, but see, he's a Kappa.
Oh
And
wow!
once I read he was a Kappa,
Oh wow!
I said,
All the
oh,
stereotypes get clear now.
so I'm about to get in trouble now. I'm about to get in trouble.
Smooth, well-dressed brother stepping around campus in his fly gear,
I'm
talking
about
about,
to
yeah,
get
we're
in
gonna have a revolution, baby.
I'm about to get in trouble, right? Because we know the stereotypes. Let's go over the stereotypes, right? Now, by the way, I was partially raised by Qs. My mentors were Qs. My male figures were Qs. So I come from
Oh, I thought you were too light-skinned for the cues, though.
look, man, and
That
and
even
and
you too light-skinned
and
for the
my and
cues,
my mentors
if
were
we go by the
disappointed that I didn't
stereotype.
pledge Q, right? They were so disappointed I didn't pledge Q. I was too scared. No way, right? But let's go over the stereotypes of these frats, right? So the alphas, right? They're the intellectuals, right?
The
You got Du
intellectuals,
Bois, you got Martin Luther King,
Dr.
they're
King,
alphas,
yep.
right? The Qs are the party bros, right?
The
They're the
thugs.
they're the they're the straight up, hanging out, watch your wife, watch your girlfriend, right? You got you got Gotta watch them around the Q,
And
right?
they loud too. They loud too,
And they're
all over
loud.
campus.
Oh my God.
Q, no, you, no.
There we go. Spike
No
Lee,
disrespect. Don't
as the
come
Q
for me.
told me, Spike Lee did that movie because he's an eternal lamp. See, he didn't go through the burning sand. See, so he did a movie exposing the whole thing. Why? Because he didn't get to go through the burning sand. Now,
That's it.
so what are Kappas? Kappas, look, they have, like Dr. Ball, they have the label on the can, okay? Kappas carry that cane. Why? Is it because they're
That cane.
disabled like I am? No, they don't carry that
Nah.
cane because they're disabled, right? Right. I got cerebral palsy and arthritis. I have a cane, right? But
I've actually never seen you walk with a cane. Now
they
that you
don't,
mention it,
they
I don't
don't,
think I've ever seen you walk
they
with a cane.
don't, they don't carry that. They don't carry that. But why do they carry that cane? Because, to use a line from Melvin Van Peebles, the Kappas view themselves as the sophisticated gents. Okay, yeah, the pretty boys. That's right, Troy. That's right, Troy. So Johnson.
Oh, damn. Really? I didn't know this.
Oh,
Spike's
I didn't know.
brother
Oh,
was
I didn't know that
killed in
either.
a frat incident.
Oh wow, I didn't know that either. That might have
Hey,
been another
shout
movie.
out to my man. I'll just call him Kane because that's how he was known on campus.
Right.
Shout out to my man Kane. The Qs almost killed him. He didn't finish.
Oh my
He
God.
didn't, and they were the ones who were upset. They wanted, he had so much clout. They were trying to like help him. Like, nah, I'm good.
By
They
the
were,
way, an aside that's not an aside. Byron Hurt has a very good documentary on hazing that I
mm,
suggest people to see. It's black fraternities, but it's also white fraternities as well, and he talks about it. I've never seen a more solvable problem. I mean, my reaction to it was, I've never seen a more solvable problem, because all you have to do if you want to haze somebody is institutionalize it and put it out in the public and call it boot camp, and then you can do to a certain degree what you want to do with these people. But
hey,
it's this
but
idea of
Todd,
having
let me
that
tell you,
instant
man.
power. Go
It
ahead.
depends who's boot camp. Because in my Navy boot camp, I had a number of brothers who had been
Mm.
through a frat experience in boot camp who said that the Navy boot camp was nothing compared to that.
Right, right, right.
So,
Well,
so
as Mark,
the military, at least the Navy might need to step up if they're trying to be, Anyway,
well, as Markham on Hill said in the documentary, he said, I talked to my father who pledged, I talked to my brother who pledged, and they all told me, he said, you know what? It's going to be okay. You're going to get past this. You're going to enjoy being a frat member as long as you ain't a punk ass nigga. That's what
oh
he said in the
damn,
documentary. And so
oh damn.
I felt the fear just in the audience. I felt the fear, like, damn,
I
okay.
went to information night when I went
Woo,
to undergrad,
woo.
and it wasn't a fear of not being able to make it. It was a disrespect to those who I thought were going to be leading the process. I was like, hell no, that's who's going to pledge
Exactly.
me? No sir,
Exactly.
no sir. Anyway, but
Exactly.
let's move on.
Exactly. Well, let's
Let's
move on.
move on.
Let's go with Bennett. So
So
let me
he's a
do.
Kappa.
He's a
So
and that's the
there's a lot.
secret. Doesn't that explain it? Doesn't that explain everything? Now, let me do a brief outline of Bennett's life, and then I'll do this kind of Bennett Clark comparison, and then I know you and I will have a lot to talk about with this Bennett Clark comparison. So let's do a brief outline. Born in poverty in the South,
Mm, yeah.
gets a college education, so he's already among the elite then, right? Uh, Joins the Atlanta Daily World, and pretty much is on the way. He's trying to get the journalism bug out of him, and I understand that, because Hemingway allegedly said journalism was a profession for people in their 20s, right?
Mm,
Had Johnson never grabbed him, he probably would have just worked at the Atlanta Daily World till he got tired, and would have gone to law school, and probably would have become, probably maybe the first head of LDF. I mean, that was the kind of trajectory he was on. But Johnson had this way of calling people up and offering them 3 times their salaries. Now, in the case of Bennett, Bennett got a referral from Robert Johnson of Jet. No
no relation.
relation to Bob Johnson of BET. To Robert Johnson of Jet. Robert Johnson refers him, and he goes on staff. Johnson sees his work ethic, his talent for history, and he decides for Johnson decides for his sake as well as Bennett's sake, well, let's cash in on this market and provide an alternative to John Hope Franklin's From Slavery to Freedom. And so Johnson creates Johnson Publishing, book publishing division, so that Bennett publishes a group of essays that he turns into the book before the Mayflower. And that takes off. He writes all of these other history books, and he becomes this kind of legend. I mean, look,
just
people
real
my
quick,
age,
did that?
yeah.
Sorry, I just meant, sorry, but
No,
did,
no,
before the Mayflower, was that a foundational read for you as it was for me, and I'm assuming others? Where were
I
you
was
in
just
that?
about to get to that. No, but let me tell
Okay,
you
my bad.
what.
Sorry.
But no, but let me tell you what was a foundational read for me. I grew up with these three brown big books. Some of you in the audience might remember this. I called them Ebony encyclopedias, but they were not Ebony
Hmm.
encyclopedias. They were a 3-volume set called A Pictorial History of Black America that that Bennett wrote and had all these photos and everything. And Bennett just wrote the whole history of Black America from this Black perspective. In fact, I was always jealous of a friend of mine, my friend Troy, because his mother got him the 4th volume, which was the 1972 yearbook, and I was hating on him when I saw that. But I literally grew up reading Lerone Bennett, and I didn't understand the significance that this was Lerone Bennett, this was Ebony, and all that. I just knew that my mom wanted me to have educational materials to read, so I grew up with those books, and that's why I'm so emotionally attached to Bennett and Ebony as it is. So that's what I grew up with. Now, when I started reading Bennett, um, my favorite Bennett book, beyond a shadow of a doubt, is a book called The Shaping of Black America.
Me too. I was gonna say this. No. It's not my favorite.
What's your
Incorrect.
favorite?
Hold on.
What's your favorite?
Forced into Glory.
Well, we're
When
gonna
he
do Force
does,
in the Glory. We're gonna
I'm
get
just
into
saying.
Force
But
in the
you asked me
Glory.
what my favorite
No,
is.
tell me.
You talk about that, boy. You talk about a beatdown. Lincoln is in his grave, lumped up.
But let me tell you, when we get to Bennett,
But Shaping is a great book. That
yeah.
was a great book for sure.
No,
Yeah.
Forced in the Glory is a very important book. But I gotta say, now this is where I get contrarian. Okay, now I'm gonna get contrarian in this discussion, audience. All right. Many Pan-Africanists, if you ask them what is their favorite televised debate or recorded debate, they're going to say when John Henry Clark debated those white folks
Mary
about
Lefkowitz and Guy
Afrocentricity, right?
Rogers. Yep.
Now, I'm a contrarian. When I watched that, I got to watch it again. I haven't watched it in a long time. When I watched it, I saw two people talking past each other with different sets of facts. But I love Dr. Clark's defense, and I love, of course, his opening line, I'm not here to debate because I only debate with my equals. All others I teach, right? Now, I'm a contrarian, right? So that's not my favorite
They did talk
televised
past
debate.
each other a lot in that.
Yeah.
And I gotta say, shout out to Utrice Lead, who
Yes.
moderated that debate.
Yes.
And from the moderator's role was the most powerful hater in the history of moderation. She was brilliant in that. Brilliant. She was my favorite. Actually, she was my favorite of the whole thing after that Clark line.
Look.
She actually was my favorite if I think about it. But go ahead.
I had a crush on Utrice Lead. And not only as a little kid, and listen, I called the City Sun when the City Sun refused to endorse Jesse Jackson, when they were virtually the only black newspaper in the United States that did not support Jesse Jackson. They had a huge picture of Jesse Jackson with the headline that says, Jesse saying ain't so. And they said, we are not endorsing you because you are not standing for black people first. I called the City Sun, got her on the phone, and said, what did you do? Right? And she's like, what do you mean? What did I do? We started having that little debate. Utrice Lead.
Hey.
Oh man.
And she was the last, and correct me if I'm wrong, the details are hazy, but she was the last effort to defend Pacifica from Amy Goodman, right? Was it that part of the end too?
Her history with BAI and Pacifica is very complex. I really can't talk about it.
Yeah, me either.
Unfortunately,
that's how I remember it.
Right. Unfortunately, she did not leave Pacifica well. She did not leave Pacifica with her reputation intact, and that's really sorry. But to show you what Utrice Lead was like, as a youngster, she was doing investigative reporting in whatever her home island was, and she stopped. And I'll tell you why she stopped, came to America, because the government came to her house.
I believe that.
That's Utrice Lead. But this tradition that we're all in, right? This is all very important, right? So I forgot how I got to the City Sun now. I know I was talking about Bennett, but somehow I got to the City
Well, the
Sun.
City Sun was you were contacting Utrice Lee,
Oh no, we were talking about the debates. What's my
the
favorite
debate,
debate? That's
and then
right.
your favorite debate
Right.
was
Was
actually.
not the Clark one, but my
Mhm.
favorite debate is a debate that I argue Bennett loses. Because my favorite debate is the 2000 Schomburg panel about Forced into Glory, where Eric Foner very politely but sweeps the floor with Bennett, going like, "Look,
Oh, I don't agree with that.
oh, I do, oh, I do. You gotta watch it, audience, because here's the
Oh,
argument. Here's the argument. Wait. Here's the argument Foner makes, and then I'm going to go into the argument Bennett makes, and we can discuss that too. Because see, Foner.
yes, Shirley.
No. He's going to have
And
me
maybe
surely
more
not
than
only
two
for the two
hours.
hours, but I'm trying to convince him to go beyond the 2 hours because I haven't even gotten into the main part of what I want to talk about yet. Right?
We're here for
So,
you. We're here. We're going. Let's
so
go.
no,
Let's
we're
go.
rolling today. We're rolling
We're
today.
streaming. We're streaming until the wheels fall off.
But let's talk about how Foner swept the floor with Bennett. And I know you don't like me saying it. And by the way, I like the fact that it's 2000, right? Dr. Clark has been gone for like 2 years, and you can tell
Mhm.
that Harlem audience that's still a real Harlem audience, not the
Mhm.
Harlem audience I was in when I was trying to challenge Zaire Ali and them folks. See, by the time I was trying to do that, you remember that when Sonia
I
Sanchez
do.
shut me down. Sonia
Yeah.
Sanchez shut me down. I wrote about it.
This was the pre Magic Johnson theaters Harlem.
Right. So nobody had my back. Although to be honest, I'll tell you who was in back of me, Dr. Ball, and I didn't put this in the essay in our book because I didn't want to seem like I was exploiting him. A dying Dr. Ben was right in back of me in a wheelchair and
Yeah, I remember
struggling
that.
to speak.
Yeah.
And I never forgot that because see, in that 2000 video that I'm talking about with Bennett, he's strong, right? And so like you got a real Harlem audience. You got Dr. Ben in the audience who comes up to speak. You got these other Harlem activists who come to speak. But Foner, here's what Foner does, right? And then I'm going to tell you how Bennett to me lost that battle but did win the war. So this is where I will agree with you. But I think Foner swept the floor with him. Foner said, look, first of all, you're stuck in your own article. I'm being more harsh than he was. The Force and the Glory comes out of a 1968. That's the year I was born, okay? A 1968 article called "Was Abraham Lincoln a White Supremacist?" And by the way, Johnson was a little concerned about this article, right?
I
But he
bet.
printed it. Right? So the first thing Foner says to him is, "You're stuck in your own article. You still think that the debate that you had in that article is the same debate we have now. What you haven't factored in is that we have already factored in those things in our discussions of Lincoln. So we talk about that Lincoln was never committed to racial equality. We do all of that. Now to prove that Bennett was dated, I'm going to prove to you that he was dated, Dr. Ball, because you watch very carefully, and I try to. There's a point where Bennett says, we this is the first real discussion we've had about history about one of these founding fathers written by a black person, and one of the people on the panel has to whisper to him, no, because the sister who wrote the book on Sally Hemings, what's her name? You know that sister
I
who
don't
wrote that book on
remember.
Sally
Yeah.
Hemings.
Yeah.
She wrote that book too, and see he forgot about that. Now it's sad that he forgot about that because he wrote the original article that talked about Jefferson's black grandchildren, right? That the sister clearly followed up on and did all the research on. I forget her name. I feel really bad. Somebody in the chat will remember the sister who wrote this major book proving that, or giving a lot of evidence, if not proving, that Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings and Thomas Jefferson had sex and his children had sex with these black slaves on the plantation. I just forgot what the book is called. Major black author did this. Her whole career was set as a result of this. So Bennett gets a little stuck. And so that's the first argument Foner makes. And I think that argument is correct. He says you're not even looking at the impact people like you and others have had on Lincoln studies. But the second thing that Foner does is Foner, and he didn't say it the way I'm saying it, but Foner's like, I read the same documents you read, right? So I know where you're quoting from and where you're not quoting from, and I know what you're leaving out. And then he starts to list all the things Bennett leaves out of the things that he's quoting to show that there was a more broader and more complex context to Lincoln's views on that. Now, that's my argument as to why Bennett lost. Now,
Yeah, I have to go back and watch
now let me take Dr. Ball's argument as to why Bennett won. Hold it. Now Bennett lets all these people talk, right? These white scholars, and he's got who's he having with them? Who that major scholar he has with them? Who's
Thank
in our
you,
book?
Gooding.
Who's in our book?
Wait, what are you talking about?
That major black scholar that's in our book. Who's like the top black scholar that's in our book on Malcolm X? I forget his name.
Strickland.
Strickland's on that panel.
Yeah, Bill
right?
Strickland. Yeah.
And so everybody criticizes Bennett. The white scholars, Strickland, all these folks. And then Bennett's like, okay, y'all all done? You done? Okay. Let me go back to what I was saying. Right? I said that Abraham Lincoln didn't want anybody black to be here. That's what I said. I said that Abraham Lincoln, that the Emancipation Proclamation freed nobody. And that's what I said. And he started marking 1-0, right? Bennett 1, y'all 0, right? But the main point he was arguing was this. Worship of Lincoln, and that's what he called it. Worship of Lincoln is an act of white supremacy. Because it even obscures the real heroes, white and black, of the abolitionist movement. But he said correctly, but see, so many of y'all have made fortunes off of celebrating Lincoln, fortunes, big academic positions and all of that for your view of Lincoln. So I've got to come as a counter because of all this Lincoln worship. Now, if Bennett sounds a little hyperbolic here, he isn't, because the only person, and you can look this up on YouTube, folks, the only person, subject matter, that has more books written about him other than Abraham Lincoln, there's only one other subject that has more books written about him than Abraham Lincoln, and that's Jesus Christ.
I believe that. And so I definitely want to go back and look at that debate again, because the way I remember thinking was, because I respect Foner. I've read Foner's work.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
I think he's sharp, but at the same time, I felt like he was doing what a lot of white and mainstream adjacent scholars do. They try to ignore or gloss over the horrors of somebody's behavior by saying, well, there's so many things we have to consider. There's so much this and that. And that's what I thought Bennett was showing, that as the title of his book says, whatever Lincoln was said to have done, he was forced into by the circumstances imposed on him by other people, including rebellious Africans, which is not, to his point, credited. So, but I have to go back and look at that. Obviously
I want to go back and look at that Clark one, because my favorite part of it, and I know you remember this, Dr. Ball, was when the white scholars were so arrogant. They made the mistake, because they talked about, well, you guys haven't studied different languages, so you don't know the original text. Remember that part? And they made a big mistake, because they asked Utrice Lead, well, how many languages do you speak? And then Utrice started listing the languages.
Now, the question specifically, Guy Rogers, in his snide, condescending self, says to her, do you speak Greek? Do you read Greek? Right. And she said, Greek? I read Greek, Latin, Spanish, English, separate dialects of this, that, and the third, French, blah, blah, blah. And then she broke it all the way down into include Black African or Black American vernacular. I was like, she was like, I speak all of that shit. And I can kick it with the sisters and brothers. I was like, man, she that was so dope. But you are right. In that debate, that was about, they spoke past each other too much. There was too much of the I thought there were moments where each could have dug deeper into the arguments of the other. But the highlight, though, the other than the ones we mentioned, is when they got Mary Lefkowitz to say on the mic that she has never been to the continent of Africa. And that's where I was like, you should forever shut the fuck. Like you can't talk, like don't talk about because she kept saying, and I appreciate the contributions of Africa. Have you ever been to Africa? No. She was like, have you been to Greece? Yes. Have you been to Rome? Yes. Have you been to wherever? Yes. Have you been to anywhere on the continent of Africa? No. Anyway, I was like, so shh.
Now look, audience.
By the way, you got all this money and all this non-teaching.
Talk about it.
I know you're not teaching more than 1 or 2 classes a year.
Talk about it, Dr. Ball.
You can't just to round out your CV. Right. Step in the northeasternmost corner of Egypt. Just to say, cross the border, go to Israel, and just step on the other side of that line for 2 minutes. Just to say, when someone asks you on a panel debate, have you been to Africa? Yeah, I've been to Africa. But no, she couldn't even do that. Anyway, let's.
And I mean, we're to quote Clark here, we're talking around the subject to get to the subject, right?
Yeah.
Because what's the subject? Disciplined commitment to decolonized thoughts. The people that we're talking about did not have quote unquote career trajectories. Their career trajectory was political education, cultural education for the liberation of a people, because they saw people rising up everywhere from the Congo to the South. And they said, okay, the time is now. If we don't educate our people now, then we're not going to be able to liberate ourselves. So these people have dedicated their lives to this, right? Whether we're talking about Utrice Lead in journalism, whether we're talking about Lerone Bennett and his scholarly journalism and his popular journalism, right? Whether we're talking about John Henry Clark and his commitment to education, these people have dedicated their lives to this. And they come out of this tradition in which you are supposed to dedicate your life to this. Now, to give you an idea of the difference between then and now, let's talk a little bit about Benjamin E. Mays. Now, you guys might remember Benjamin E. Mays was the president of Morehouse College, and he mentored some guy named Martin Luther King Jr. But he also mentioned Lerone. He also mentored Lerone Bennett, and I'm going to get to that when we do, at least at the close of this hour or the beginning of the next hour, this comparison between Bennett and Clark. But let's look at what Mays taught people at Morehouse. This is a direct quote from Mays that I got from Dr. West. Again, I really appreciate his attention to detail because I really didn't know, again, this context, right? So here's what Mays said to his black men at Morehouse about what the purpose of life is. Check this out. And I'm going to say this twice. Quote, die poor, unknown, unloved, a failure, a disgrace even, but never shut your eyes to the truth. One more time. Die poor, unknown, unloved, a failure, a disgrace even, but never shut your eyes from the truth. Now, that gives you an idea of what people were taught that we're not taught today. In fact, we're really taught the opposite of that today. So, people like Bennett, they're in a tradition in which they're trying to liberate themselves. They're not trying to market, right? Cornel West repeatedly says, don't call what you do. He says, I don't market a brand. I'm not marketing a brand. He says, I'm championing a cause. And see, that's where we've messed up. We've gone from championing a cause to marketing a brand, and the brand we're marketing is ourselves. See,
Yeah, we have
that's
it exactly opposite now. I mean, that
it's
just listening
exactly
to that,
opposite.
it's die rich, well
Right,
known,
right,
loved
right,
by the
right,
most elite.
right,
Uh, yeah, that's wow. And
right.
ignore the truth if necessary.
And or patent it down so you can be on MSNBC. Just smooth it
Mm,
out, right?
mm,
Smooth it out. Like I always say, they don't want Oreos anymore. They want smoothies.
mm, mm, mm,
So
mm.
unless we have 9 minutes to talk about something else, I can jump into this Clark and
Nah,
Bennett
what do you
comparison.
let's I
I mean,
mean,
I'm still programmed by columnist Dr. Ball. So I think in terms of NPR type terms, like at the
no.
top of the hour, we'll talk about this.
Yeah,
Right,
no.
right, right.
No. We don't have to worry about
We
that.
don't do that. All right. So let me do some notes here on this Bennett and Clark comparison. All right.
Hmm.
So these are notes, folks. And Dr. Ball, please interrupt me whenever you want to discuss these things because I think again they're very important. I think your interruptions will be important here because of your own work in terms of studying Dr. Clark from the intellectual history that he comes from. All right, so Lerone Bennett, born in Southern rural poverty. John Henry Clark, ditto. Now, both men had women teachers. Dr. Clark said his teacher was a deity to him, right? I don't know if Bennett says that because we don't have him to talk about this, but note how from the beginning they were both shaped by African women. For Bennett, it was Mrs. Keeling, one of his teachers, and for Dr. Clark, it was of course Mrs. Taylor, right? The famous grade school
Evelina.
teacher he
Hmm.
talks about. All right. Bennett mastered the library and bookstore, avid readers of black newspapers. Dr. Clark, ditto. Bennett, he did middle class. Remember, he's a Kappa. Remember, he's a college graduate. He's a Kappa. So he does middle class work, writing, right? While Dr. Clark struggles to write while doing what? At some point, running a sandwich stand. At some point, mopping up the studios at NBC, right? He's a head janitorial person at NBC before they throw him into the front office for a minute, right? So we have very different experiences here. Bennett becomes very committed to Chicago, the second city, right? So the black community there, they're the second great black community, the second cool black community, right? Because why? Because Dr. Clark's committed to the first great black community, and that's Harlem, right? So I'm showing my New Jersey roots here, right? About who's the capital of Black America? Not Black Chicago, Harlem. But they're both committed to a black city within a white city. Bennett, key mentor, Benjamin E. Mays. Clark, key mentor, Arthur Schomburg, John G. Jackson, right? Bennett, graduate of Morehouse. Clark, graduate of the street activists and the street scholars of New York City. He does go to NYU briefly after World War II, but he is a self taught and self trained scholar, as is Bennett, because Bennett didn't study history. Bennett was learning history on his off hours while at the Atlanta Daily World, and it's Johnson that allows him to go do the deep dives. Bennett served in Korea. Clark served in World War II. Bennett, he had the Amistad Society, which he has much later in his development as a historian in Chicago. While, of course, we know Clark has the Harlem History Club / Blyden Society / Harlem Writers Workshop. Bennett allegedly grew into public radicalism and Pan-Africanism, and I'm going to say why allegedly in a moment, where Clark, as we know, started radical and stayed radical. And I have here both were self-trained popular historians who were treated with quiet and sometimes loud disdain by professionally trained historians. Bennett and Clark believed in Black history as, quote, living history, unquote, and as weapons for liberation. Bennet, confidant of Martin Luther King. Clark, confidant of Malcolm X. And both wrote books on the people they were confidants of. Bennet taught at Northwestern, which I want to get into. Clark taught at Hunter College. Bennet assisted in Africana Studies development. Clark led Africana Studies development. But both never left the community lecture circuit. Bennet involved in Institute of the Black World. Clark involved with First World. Bennet, supporter of Harold Washington. Clark, supporter of Adam Clayton Powell Jr. Bennet, home publication, Ebony and Jet. Clark, home publication, first the Pittsburgh Courier, and then Freedom Ways. Both wrote books that were outgrowths of articles. Both had to balance ideological tensions between people at those periodicals, which we can talk about at length in terms of what Bennett had to deal with at Ebony and what Clark had to deal with at Freedom Ways. Excuse me. Both were Black famous and synonymous within their Black cities, in quotes, right? Both were recognized leaders in Black arts and in Black letters. Bennet did not deal with whites in terms of publications. Clark dealt with whites publishers. Bennet and Clark educated 2 generations of Black people. And I'm talking about generation, I mean the original generation term, which is a 30-year term, right? Bennet does it as a magazine writer, and Clark does it mostly as a lecturer or orator. Bennet publicly went up against white scholars over Lincoln. Clark publicly went up against white scholars over ancient Africa. Now, both span the 20th century. Bennet was born in 1928 and died in 2018. Clark was born in 1915 and died in 1998. Now, there's some other notes I'll get to with Bennet as we continue going throughout the hour, but I wanted to give that comparison because we rarely show all of the same influences that these people had, right? And to put it in Kappa terms, how do you really summarize Clark versus Bennet? Clark said he never owned an automobile. Remember that, Dr. Ball? Said he never owned an automobile. He said, but he paid those college tuition for his kids in full and on time. While Bennet, being that he was on the Ebony list, which I know we'll talk about in a couple of minutes, the very famous Ebony list, Bennet owned the Cadillac. Because everybody on that list owned the Cadillac. So we have the Cadillac versus the Nolac, right? But both coming to the same conclusions, both having the same priorities, and both having the same work and same enemies. That's the 20th century tradition that Dr. Ball and myself have dedicated our lives to trying to study.
I appreciate that. That is a really good parallel breakdown and fascinating. Now, you said you wanted to talk about Bennett at Northwestern. What in particular about that?
Well, let's tie that in with Turner. Yeah.
And just quickly, how much of what you've covered or discussed is at least supplemented by West's book?
You mean what I've listed right here?
Yeah. Or even what you're going to talk about in terms of Northwestern?
Well, I mean, what I'm doing now is I'm interpreting West's facts. West is excellent on facts. He did clearly the maximum amount of archival research that you could do on Lerone, Bennett, and Ebony magazine, whatever he had access to. He clearly did the maximum, right? Mm-hmm. But what he doesn't do is the kind of things that Dr. Ball, you are trained to do, and I am training myself to do, right? Which is to do the cross sections. How do these things match? How do these things meld, right? How is Bennett's one story or his one drop in the ocean, how does it match the ocean, right? So West can do that only up to a certain extent because he understands facts, right? But he doesn't understand how all of these things kind of blend together to form a tapestry of discovery, education, revolution.
All right,
That's what,
I just want to. I'm going to continue to point out every time you do it when you come on here and publicly make these nonsensical statements about
go.
something I've
Here we
accomplished or
go.
achieved that you haven't or can't do. This shit
Here
is
we go.
ridiculous. So,
Here we
but
go.
that's all right. So let's get to Northwestern because there is
Let's
an
get to
overlap
Northwestern
between the
and let's
Bennett
tie
and
in
Turner at
Northwestern
Northwestern.
with
That's right.
Bennett and Clark and all of that. And again, these are the kind of things that, if West was here, he would go into all of the details about Northwestern, right? But you and I don't really need those details because we know them. We just have to share the relevant details to our audience, right? So let's do that. But before I do that, let me do something that West does very well, and I think it's very significant. He compares Bennett and Before the Mayflower to John Hope Franklin's From Slavery to Freedom. And I think that comparison is very important when we talk about, to what side people are on and all of that, because I like John Hope Franklin. And I'm very clear that John Hope Franklin, I know what side he was on internally, right? Because remember his father went through the rebellion, right? The white rebellion,
That's right.
and so
That's right.
so I know where John Hope Franklin is, as I like to say, you get these people drunk and they sound like us, right? I know what John Hope Franklin really is, right? I know who he really is. But they look.
Look, I remember because I remember vividly even where I was. It was in the Navy where I did read Franklin. And then I did read Before the Mayflower.
Right.
I mean, if there was ever any good to going on these cruises, it was the time to do this reading. But again, shout out to Dr. Haight. Reading is not the same as studying. But even then, I don't think I could have explained it, and I don't remember the details now. But I remember thinking Before the Mayflower is a little bit better, a little bit more. But talk about that. What does Wes say about the differences, and what do you think about what Wes?
Well, let me first see. Even what you just said right there, we got to take a break and talk about a whole nother tradition.
All right.
Let's talk about the tradition of Black men in the military who become avid readers and writers. Because see, what you just by the very act that you read those books in the military means you're in a tradition. So whose tradition are you in, Dr. Ball, by starting your education with that free time in the service? I want to tell you whose tradition you're in. Because who did the same thing? Some guy from Tennessee who went into the Coast Guard and did his reading and writing on his own in the Coast Guard on his off hours, and later on, became such a proficient writer because he was writing letters to all his friends in the Coast Guard, for their girlfriends, right? And he was so successful in that, and people saw that he wrote so well. He became the first Black PR director of the Coast Guard. There was never a PR director of the Coast Guard, chief journalist of the Coast Guard, because of his power of writing and because he did all this reading and writing on his own in the Coast Guard. Who am I talking about, Dr. Ball?
I only know now because of the chat. I didn't remember this, but
Alex Haley.
Yeah.
Alex Haley.
The chat is sharp. My memory is not. So
Alex Haley. Now,
shout out to the chat.
Let's talk about another tradition. Let's talk about another person in the tradition.
Undefeated. The chat is undefeated.
The chat is undefeated, right? I'm not looking at the chat this time because I'm trying to focus on all this information, right? But I want to go and look at the chat. I want to go look at the chat. All right. I'm sorry I can't look at y'all today. I'm going to go back. I'm going to go back and look at the chat later. But let's talk about another person in that tradition, another brother growing up where he gets basically a college education from his military stint, from doing all this reading, right? Who am I talking about? A young brother by the name of Don L. Lee. Who we know of today as Hakeem Matabuti. So see this tradition.
Real quick, shout out again to Dr. Turner.
Go ahead.
Because I had the privilege, because Turner knew everybody and everybody liked Turner.
Yes.
I was in the room where Amiri Baraka and Hakeem Booty got together, I think for the first time in I don't know how long. And Booty said, he made a whole joke. He said he talked about how he was given that name because he was like, he was like, who the hell would pick Hakeem Booty? Name you can't even spell, can't even read, you don't know I can say it right. Who would pick that? Especially with I was Don Lee. And now, now anyway, go ahead.
Right. No, I mean, and then it's all real stuff here, right? Okay. Can't get this anywhere else, audience. Okay, so that's that tradition. So let's now go to Northwestern. Now let's put Northwestern in context, which is what West does well, right? But you and I have to put it in better context. All right. We have to do things that West might not know how to do. That's no fault of his own, by the way. I'm just saying, he's from England. I can't discuss, cricket, right? I can only go with the facts on cricket, right? The spirit of cricket,
Hey.
That's got to be done by somebody else.
Started. It was a great weekend of football this weekend.
Football, you mean, right? Football.
Anyway,
yes. Okay. All right. Dr. Ball knows I'm corny. I don't watch sports on the weekend. I either read comics or I read very serious Black biographies. I have the new book on my nightstand. I have the new book on Claude McKay, Making of a Black Bolshevik. Like that's on my nightstand to read, and it's right on top of the Green Lantern in Blackest Night omnibus. Right? So anyway, let's get to Northwestern. Let's get to Northwestern. So, what's the context? Okay. As Albert Murray and Ralph Ellison predicted in their letters, because when you read the Trading 12s, the letters of Albert Murray and Ralph Ellison, they talk about being at Howard and how everybody in the history department is laughing at this one guy at Howard who they said is kicking his own ass, doing all these papers and doing all these presentations and all that. And I think it's Murray who's laughing at the people who are laughing at this guy. Because what Murray says to Ellison in the letter is, see, they don't get it that when the doors open up, he's going to be the first person out, right? And so who are we talking about? We're talking about John Hope Franklin, right? The only thing I have in common with John Hope Franklin is that we both once lived in Hyattsville. That's it, right?
Shout out to Hyattsville, Maryland.
Shout out to Hyattsville. I spent 25 years in Hyattsville reading, Dr. Ball remembers my big messy apartment with all the books and papers everywhere. Absolutely. Hyattsville, Maryland. Love it. Miss it. So the doors open up. And so you have people stepping in. So for instance, Ralph Ellison wants to be with the white elitists, right? So he's struggling to write the second novel because he's stuck on this white elitist idea that you can't be a novelist if you've only written one novel. So he's stuck for the rest of his life trying to do that, trying to satisfy people who he wants to be with, right? John Hope Franklin goes and starts a teaching career as a historian, and he develops. But John Hope Franklin was always somebody that the establishment liked because he could state things very clearly, but also very objectively, kind of like the way Jelani Cobb does. Like Jelani Cobb is like hyper objective, right? He's now head of the journalism department at Columbia. So now you got two major journalism schools run by Black men.
And let me tell you, I gotta jump in again. Let me tell you why Jelani Cobb don't like your boy. There's two reasons, and one is very much related to today. Wow. Jelani Cobb don't like your boy, because he came to College Park and did a panel many years ago and the discussion was hip hop.
Right.
And from the Q&A section, the questions I raised about how they did not incorporate any kind of structural analysis and just did the whole regular, we give the rap is getting worse because y'all don't want nothing good, like that whole kind of nonsense. He didn't like the challenge that I presented there and was very disrespectful to me after the fact. but was protected because I was there with my newly born baby girl. So I was much more, friendly. But the other reason, and this is more relevant, that he doesn't like your boy is because a former co-host of mine on WPFW told him that I had said to her, we have a chance to spend 2 hours with Dr. James Turner. Tell Jelani Cobb he can't come on this week.
Right.
And she was like, no, I think they could be on the and of course, Dr. Turner was all gracious, like, let's share the time. Of course, Brother Cobb can come on. Of course. So we sat there for 2 hours, wasting half of it listening to Jelani Cobb's MSNBC ass. Right. We have Dr. Turner on. And because it was made clear that I did not agree with that, Cobb felt the kind of way. So and I'm right, even more so now that Dr. Turner is not here anymore. I stand correct.
I don't know Jelani Cobb, but he did do me a solid once when I was at the inaugural swearing in of Ross Baraka for his first term as mayor of Newark, New Jersey. Ross had gathered together his hip hop crew, Kevin Powell, Jelani Cobb, all of these folks from back in the day, and they were up in the VIP room. They were literally in a VIP room celebrating their hip hop success. So I was trying to just get in the main gate, and they were trying to lock me out the main gate. So I called for Jelani to come and help me through this gate. We came back and helped me through the gate. That's my only interaction. Shirley, you don't know Dr. Ball like I do. No, his girls have saved him from a lot of interactions. Right?
No, I do. I don't. It's not. I wouldn't say I don't blame her. I thank her.
No, it's not blame,
because I should. There was no need for me to get any rah over it, which I probably would have had she not been there. So I thank her for that.
No, that's what I'm saying. Yeah, his daughters help him out.
But look, the best thing I think Jelani Cobb has done is he wrote publicly that Peniel Joseph intentionally only wrote about Kwame Ture in the years when he was known as Stokely Carmichael, so he would not have to deal with Ture. That's the only thing I think that I've seen Jelani Cobb do that I was like. But anyway,
but I want to get to Jelani Cobb because this kind of hyper-objective approach.
The new dean of the Columbia School of Journalism.
New dean of the Columbia School of Journalism. This hyper-objective approach. It works for certain people, right? Like Jelani Cobb did a great documentary on the Newark police brutality from the Newark police. And he was hyper objective because he basically let the police hang themselves. Because he showed that to the police, there is no such thing as a bad interaction. Right? And so you can watch this documentary on Frontline. You can watch it on YouTube. Type in Jelani Cobb Frontline. It's going to come right up. Police and the police, whatever, right? And he did write my mayor's autobiography for audiobook, Audible or whatever, which I have not read, but he did write that. But anyway, let's go back to Franklin. But there is this hyper-objective approach, right, which Franklin represents, right? And with Franklin, to show you the difference between a Bennett and a Franklin talks about, does not brag about, but talks about how the people at Knopf begged him more than once to write From Slavery to Freedom. He said it got to the point where Mr. Knopf himself went down to wherever he was to personally, open up the checkbook and say, look, we want you to write this book. We need you to write this book.
That's interesting.
And he said that's how From Slavery to Freedom got made.
Because to me, that I read that as more as a criticism. Why is that publisher so interested in you writing this book? Like, what possibly could you be writing that would make him this excited? But anyway,
because he'd be hyper objective.
He'd be hyper objective, and which there's a better way of there's a better description of what you're saying. I don't know what it is yet, but
well, we'll get there. We'll get there. So
yeah, go ahead.
So anyway, West does a great job in the book on Bennett, the biography on Bennett, Our Kind of Historian. He does a great job showing the difference between Bennett's work and Franklin's work, because Franklin is writing for the popular audience and Bennett is writing for the popular audience, but Franklin is trying to prove himself to be a professional historian. He shows a maximum amount of detachment, et cetera, where Bennett is doing what I think the best historians do, is to be kind of a dramatist. Now, there's a white dramatist history tradition too that I want to do another side on, because I want to give you the full context. I want to give our audience full context. There are white historians who don't have PhDs in history who write major books. But see, Bennett, we only had Bennett and this one magazine, right? But white people had a whole magazine that created all of these popular historians, and this magazine was called American Heritage. It still exists. It's just on a website. It still exists. But this is where we get David McCullough and all of these like writers, these very good writers of popular history who know how to write very well, who regular historians hate on because they don't know how to write well, right? So Bennett is even coming out of a one-man black tradition of American heritage, that kind of writing, right? So Bennett develops as a historian on his own in the library when he's not at Ebony, when he's not covering the civil rights movement, and he produces a counter narrative to kind of like the John Hope Franklins, right? So these two kind of quote unquote competing books that do the same thing. Now let's get to Northwestern and let's get to the larger
But
context.
I thought that the difference was that I thought that the difference is that one was written Franklin's targeting a white mainstream audience, and Bennett was trying to target a black mainstream audience. Is that?
I don't want to insult Franklin like that, but if that's the conclusion you drew, I'm not going to argue with your conclusion, Dr. Ball.
Which is why I would think that the whole thing about the invitation from the publisher makes more sense now.
Right.
But anyway,
I'm not arguing that point. So the doors open up, right? The doors open up all the way, right? And I want to do another aside. When the doors open up in journalism, they don't open up for people in the black press who've been stalwarts in the black press, because white people don't want to deal with them, because they'd rather deal with this new baby boomer generation that's coming up that doesn't have any connection to the black press or to those radical struggles, not in total. And that's where we get the generation that founds the National Association of Black Journalists, right? So we wonder why, they take, kind of weak stands, like on things like Momma and stuff like that, is because they come out of a new tradition, they would say, that says we're going to be black on black terms and on mainstream terms, right? So that's a very complicated balance. And they all claim Lerone Bennett because they all grown up reading Lerone Bennett, right? So when they become columnists and things like that, that's their way of getting out their inner Lerone Bennett, their inner James Baldwin, their inner, whoever, right? So we have that tradition. But let's get to this Northwestern and this Africana tradition. So like I said, that Les Edmonds said to me that, we had these conversations among ourselves, and we said, some of us are going to have to go in these institutions and deal with these people, right? I mean, to use I got to throw my geek references in here, Dr. Ball. So I'm going to use one that only a few people might remember. So a lot of these people decided that they were going to be stoned by day, warriors by night, right? So when Africana studies developed, me too, Prester John. I'm not dogging Franklin.
Yeah, me too. No, I'm just, me too. Right. I'm not saying I didn't get anything from it, and I'm doing this from old memory. But if I'm trying to quickly isolate a difference between Bennett and Franklin, that would have been it. But it's not that it's not that Franklin didn't do good work or valuable work. But anyway.
Not only did Franklin do valuable work, he constantly revised that book the same way Bennett constantly revised his book. And Franklin went back to Africa. Like, when he got really into it, he said, okay, the radical historians are right. We can't just start this with the Negro, right? So even in Franklin's later works, he starts in Africa and then goes to America and all of that. No, I give Franklin a lot of props.
And I would have missed all of that. So I would have probably missed all of that anyway. So that's not, I'm not trying to, I was just trying to come up with a quick, isolated different. And I do tend to think that that difference is correct, even as he did good work. And it looks like Dr. West is joining us.
Oh, he's coming in.
By the way, yeah, he's
Oh,
just
okay,
showed up
great.
in the
Let's
back.
get him. Let's get him in.
So we'll add Dr. West to the stream. Greetings to you, Dr. West. Appreciate you joining us. We've been talking about and around your work all morning. But greetings, welcome.
Hi guys, can you hear me okay?
We can hear you fine. I've been trying to rep your work the best I can, Dr. West, but I'm glad you're here to rep it ourselves. Let me tell you where we're at in our discussion. We're combining Lerone Bennett with John Henry Clark and with James Turner, who recently passed. And I know you're familiar with James Turner because you mentioned him a couple of times in our kind of historian. So what we were about to do is talk about Bennett's tenure at Northwestern. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to set up that discussion for you, and then I'm going to let you talk about his tenure at Northwestern because I think it's very significant. So let me do the setup for you. So as I was talking about with Dr. Ball, there was a decision made that some of the people in the movement were going to have to go and desegregate these major white universities and put together Africana studies. And I did a popular culture joke, stone by day, warriors by night. And to continue that, betrayed by the humans we were sworn to protect, right? In a way, that cartoon that I'm referencing is very much real in terms of what these scholars went through. And one of the things, Dr. West, that I talked about with Dr. Ball is that what makes Bennett, I mean, you gave me the key to Bennett. You gave me the secret to Bennett. You missed the beginning of the program where I talked about that. The fact that he's a Kappa and the fact that he's kind of like from the bourgeois class and that he's on Johnson's good list where he has the Cadillac and everything, I think influenced why he did not stay at Northwestern. I think he just had better options than Northwestern. But if you could tell for our audience the story of Bennett at Northwestern, and you can go as long as you want because I think it's a very significant story. It has Sterling Stuckey and other folks in it. So please talk about why he went to Northwestern and why he left Northwestern.
Yeah, thanks, Todd. And hi to everyone in the audience. Sorry, I'm pretty late onto the chat. I'll save you the details, but mainly involved flat tires and other nonsense. And
sorry to hear that.
Getting the time.
Well, we appreciate you making it anyway, and take your time, no rush. And please do pepper in any references you make to Dr. Turner in your book. I haven't had a chance, unfortunately, to read it yet.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of having this discussion just after Professor Turner's passing, and I'm sure you've already discussed his incredible role in the development of Africana studies, Black studies, and we can talk a bit about his relationship with Bennett in particular. But Bennett and Northwestern. So, for the context of the book, most of my understanding of Bennett's time at Northwestern comes from his own papers and from his relationship to people like Vincent Harding, who I'm sure many listeners are familiar with. And also a few of his former students. So Lillian Williams was someone who I talked to who went to Northwestern as a student when Bennett was there, and she was really helpful for the book, for giving me a sense of how students responded to Bennett. So there's kind of two bits to the Bennett story at Northwestern, and the first is his visiting professorship in the late 60s, and then he goes back in the early 70s to be the first chair of Northwestern's Afro, as it was called at the time, the Afro-American Studies Department, the nascent department. And the first time he's there, this is really coming within the context of elite research universities, Ivy League unis, trying to respond to the Black Studies movement, the impact of Black Power. And you see it all over the place. You see it at Columbia, you see it to an extent at University of Chicago, you see it at Northwestern, and you see it in other places. This drive to try and bring new Black perspectives onto campus, and that's led, I think it's important to stress that that's led almost always by Black students, Black student unions, and Black student activists. So now, retrospectively, when universities like to give themselves a lot of credit their role in instigating Black studies, I think it's important to remember that it's never administration or white faculty that are leading this. It's always, you know, Black students, Black student activists, local Black communities who want institutions like Northwestern to be accountable to them, even more so on the South side with University of Chicago. So Bennett is a kind of consensus choice among Black students, of which kind of James Turner is involved in the student movement at Northwestern. And he comes on for about a year. I think it's 68 to 69. And there's a few other people who come into Northwestern at around that time. So one of those is CLR James. And by all accounts, Bennett's very popular. You know, he's a very engaging guy generally. And he lectures. He kind of devises a couple of courses that are focused on Black history, and he lectures, and it goes down very well. And then he goes back to Johnson Publishing, but the relationship was kind of opened. And then a couple of years later, after this quite drawn-out process of moving towards establishing a Department of Afro-American Studies, Bennett is again on people's list to come on board as the founding chair of that department. So, yeah, like he's appointed. It's received very well. Black students are very happy. The faculty at Northwestern is happy about the decision because they think that Bennett can give them a kind of a certain degree of credibility, and he has this reputation as a scholar, but also as an activist. And it looks for a moment as if it's maybe going to be a quite significant departure from his relationship with Johnson Publishing. So he's been at Johnson Publishing since the early to mid 1950s. He's really gone at Johnson Publishing. He's gone from being a talented but fairly kind of rank and file journalist to being this, you know, popular historian on a level maybe, you know, beyond anyone else in the country. Apart from, you know, you've already mentioned John Hope Franklin, but he's a slightly different type of historian. But then it kind of falls apart very quickly. So within about 5 or 6 months, Bennett has formally resigned his position as the founding chair. And there's a bit of a student backlash. Like there's some student protests, and students are very keen to have Bennett reconsider. But ultimately, Bennett, you know, and Northwestern part. So there's this very brief moment in 1972 where Bennett is going to come on as the founding chair, and he has these big ambitions and he has these big designs for the department, and he has a very kind of ambitious long-term strategy that he wants to enact. And then we can talk about it more, but there's some personal disagreements, there's some other stuff going on with Bennett, but ultimately he leaves Northwestern very, very soon after he's appointed. And that's really the last time that he has any kind of formal academic position. So that's kind of the background for how.
Just
Bennett...
very quickly, no, thank you for that. But just very quickly, we had our takes on it. But when you mentioned that Franklin is a different kind of historian, how would you quickly summarize that difference between Franklin and Bennett?
I mean, they come from different traditions. I mean, you know, the first of that is training. John Hope Franklin is an academically trained historian. He's a professionally trained historian. He is one of the kind of greatest academic historians, I would say, of the 20th century. But that's a very different trajectory to Bennett, who, I mean, Bennett's first degree wasn't in history. Like he doesn't have a PhD in history apart from like a bunch of honorary PhDs. He came to history writing,
which are EDs.
Okay.
They're not PhDs. The honorary doctorate is not a PhD. Just to throw some shade.
Yeah.
Just want to throw some shade a little bit on a Monday morning. Anyway, go ahead. Sorry about that.
No, that's good. So he comes from a different kind of way of thinking about and writing history. And he goes, Bennett in interviews with, he always goes back to his family and also his early mentors. So some of his early teachers, you know, when he was growing up in Jackson, talking about making history like jump, skip, and dance, like making history exciting, making it this idea of a living history, like that kind of direct connection. And that's like one part of it, and that's linked to like professional training and the way that they think about history. Another part of it is that Bennett, like, so I say in the book, kind of the way that Bennett writes history is that he writes history for Black people and from a Black perspective. And what I mean by that is that that's not necessarily, you know, white people engaged with Bennett. He didn't solely write history from around a Black nationalist perspective or anything like that, but his imagined audience and his core audience and his desired audience was Black people, like consistently.
I told you. Thank you,
Yeah.
Dr. West. I tried to tell him.
He did try to tell me, Dr. West. Although one of the things I might disagree with you, I think he did write from a Black nationalist perspective. I think that he just did it in such an elegant way that it didn't seem like polemics.
Yeah,
right?
like I think he definitely did, like at certain moments in his career, and it comes through quite pronounced, particularly in the late 60s, early 70s. So in some ways, like he is part of that tradition, but I'm just saying what I mean is like he's not beholden to that tradition. Like that's not the only kind of strand of Black intellectual thought that he draws on. But I mean, from Franklin's perspective, like Franklin really, for a lot of his career, he predominantly saw himself as a Southern historian, really.
Right.
Like a historian
correct.
of the US South.
That's correct.
He didn't really, like he had relationships with like Asala and those type of organizations, but he didn't, to my knowledge, he wasn't really like involved in like an African-American studies department or anything like that.
He never had a dashiki in his closet. Right.
And in fact, if I remember correctly, he spoke negatively about Black studies. He was not a supporter of Black studies, was Franklin. Like, so.
Yeah.
Anyway, we just, you know.
No, that's important to say.
Yeah.
Dr. West, let me ask you a question. I'm so glad you're here because, I mean, I'm so deeply impressed with these 3 books about the Black press in one city, Chicago, right? So why Chicago and not, you know, New York or LA? I mean, what is it about Chicago that has these kind of independent people who produce these magazines? Because I'm not only thinking about Johnson, I'm also thinking about on the white side of town. There was this guy named Hugh Hefner who had his own idea for a magazine that even had, okay, Dr. Ball's laughing, but he even had some intellectual content in that magazine, right? For a mainstream magazine, right? So I mean, what is it about Chicago and even Oprah Winfrey, right? What is it about Chicago that produces these people?
We're just dragging everybody into this conversation now.
She's got an empire, I gotta ask.
Yeah. I think there's probably a couple of different answers to that, and it probably depends whether you ask like Black Chicagoans, who might give you one type of answer.
Right.
If you ask scholars, it might give you another type of answer. I mean, I think, I mean, in terms of like work on Black Chicago and that entrepreneurial kind of tradition, I mean, people like Robert Weems, Devarian Baldwin, Jason Chambers, those type of scholars have written kind of much more eloquently than I could on that subject, and I'd recommend particularly Devarian Baldwin's work is like kind of the go-to for anything on Black Chicago. So if anyone listening isn't familiar with Devarian Baldwin's work, I'd definitely recommend checking it out. But like my take on it is, you have I would argue more so than in New York even. Chicago has a kind of very strong history of kind of labor activism and internationalism that kind of overlaps with ideas of the Black Popular Front in Chicago. And you see that particularly around the 30s and the 40s. And I think that feeds into the media coverage, and it creates a space for the creation of new types of media. And I think, you know, in the work that I do, one of the overarching arguments I'm trying to make is really making the case for Chicago being the capital of print culture, black print culture in the 20th century, more so than New York, because I think, you know, most of the time people think of the Harlem Renaissance and they think of maybe like The Crisis or The Messenger or Negro World, or those types of publications, and they're very, very influential. But you know, if you look at like Chicago Defender, Johnson Publishing, Muhammad Speaks, a few others, like these are some of the most important black newspapers and periodicals of the 20th century, and they're all based out of Chicago. And in some ways, something like Johnson Publishing could only really have emerged in Chicago because it's connected so specifically to the South Side, and it comes out of, you know, like Johnson Publishing, like so many of these different black publishing companies in Chicago start in black businesses. They like rent offices from black businesses. So like the Supreme Life building, because Supreme Life was one of the biggest black insurance companies of the 20th century. So many black publishing companies and black publications start out of the Supreme Life building or start out of the Overton building. And it's about that kind of that broader culture of black entrepreneurship on the South Side, and that relationship between black publishing and black print and black business. And I think, I mean, I would argue Chicago is kind of the epicenter for that. And
it's deep, you know. Since we're talking a little bit about this, this reminds me of one of my least favorite moments when defending my thesis in front of the very Chicago Dr. Bob Harris and the epitome of New York, Dr. James Turner, and I got nervous and said Richard Wright. I counted him among the Harlem writers. And I saw immediately Turner's his eyebrow raised. And I think he might have let it slide, but Harris was like, no, sir. No, sir. Chicago, baby. Chicago. And I what's that meme now where Homer Simpson fades into the bushes? I was trying to slip back into my seat, disappear into my chair. Anyway, so I'm very good. I'm glad you clarified and made that point. I think that's a good point to me. Anyway.
I want to talk, James, about the list, the famous Johnson list, and who was on it and who wasn't. But I mentioned earlier in the show my emotional attachment with Johnson Publications, because I said, you know, Johnson to me, regardless of his negatives, is somebody who hired not one, not two, but three Pan-Africanists, and also later on hired A. Peter Bailey, right? Malcolm X's PR director, right? But before we get to A. Peter Bailey, if we want to get to him, and I think you might want to get to him, because I know in your other book you talk about how Lerone Bennett was the kind of mentor of these younger black writers who were definitely black nationalists who were brought into Ebony in the late 60s. But before we do that, I know there's a book on Hoyt Fuller, and I know you know a lot about Hoyt Fuller, and I know we know about Bennett. But we forget about the third Pan-Africanist that was already on payroll when Johnson came in. And that's a woman that we really have not ever discussed the way we should. And her name is Arabelle Thompson. So please talk a little bit about Arabelle Thompson for us.
Yeah, definitely. So Arabelle Thompson, for listeners who don't know, is a force of nature. She comes out of the Dakotas, and she talks about not really like having any interaction with black culture or black people really at all until she moves to Chicago. You know, she's raised in just like an almost exclusively white environment, really. And she moves to Chicago, and she joins Johnson Publishing. She actually joins Johnson Publishing on the back of she writes an autobiography at quite a young age. I believe it's called American Daughter. And on the back of that, Johnson hires her, and she works as a managing editor early on, and she's faced with quite a lot of challenges early on, particularly like most mid-century American newsrooms. Johnson Publishing is a pretty sexist environment. and she kind of has to go against that. And then over time, she butts heads, particularly with advertising advertising executives as well, over like what exactly goes into the magazine. But she eventually becomes, the foreign correspondent effectively for Johnson Publishing Company. So she becomes the international editor, and she's tasked with most of the company's big international stories. So she goes on a series of like really extensive overseas trips. And a few people have written about this, like Jinx Coleman Broussard, who's at Louisiana State, I believe. She's written on Irabel, which is someone I'd recommend, and a few other people. So Irabel goes on these like month-long tours of, she does like a massive African trip in the 50s that feeds into the publication of a second book called Africa, Land of My Fathers, I believe it's called. And she's arrested in South Africa because they find out that she works for Johnson Publishing, and circulation, particularly of Ebony, is kind of banned for a period. And she's someone who's really playing a major role in pushing the magazine towards a more Pan-Africanist position, particularly early on. Once you get into the 60s, people like Bennett and also Hoyt Fuller, who we've mentioned, kind of take that up and move it forward. But particularly 50s into the early 60s in particular, Irabel has a really, really important role in trying to have more international coverage, more coverage of the Black diaspora, and in particular, more Pan-African and more kind of sub-Saharan African coverage.
So as usual, an African woman sets the basis for African men to go forward. Yeah, we really need to lift her name up, Arabelle Thompson. So let's talk a little bit about the famous list, who was on the famous, why the list was created, who was on the list and who wasn't on the list. And then, James, I want you to talk about one of the advantages that Johnson had being on the list was that he was able to mentor these younger Black nationalists who came in and were at Ebony. I mean, they were at Ebony for about 5 minutes, but they were still at Ebony. So please talk about the list, who was on it, who was not, and then these younger reporters.
Yeah, sure. So Johnson, it kind of becomes almost this myth later on, and he talks about it in interviews. And John Johnson talks about, like at the heart of my office, or like I've got this kind of secret space in my office where I have this list, and it's basically a list of people who he needs at the company, and like these people, he, whatever they want, he will give them to make sure they stay at the company. In terms of people who are on that list, we can speculate. I would say that Bennett is definitely on that list. I think there are people who are on that list and then move off it. I think there are people who are never on that list, and we can maybe speculate where Hoyt Fuller sits on that. But I think this idea of the list and Johnson's list is useful because it really gives us an insight into Johnson as a manager and as an entrepreneur. And I'm quite, in the stuff that I write about Johnson Publishing, I'm quite critical of Johnson, his politics, his ideology. Other scholars are very critical of Johnson. But one of the things I do give Johnson a lot of credit for is that he is very pragmatic in terms of, he understands that having a diversity of opinion within his magazines, even though he himself is, moderate, moving towards conservative on quite a few issues, he understands that having people like Fuller, like Alan Morrison, like A. Peter Bailey, David Lawrence, these kind of characters, whose own politics are very different from Johnson's in many ways. He understands that having them under the JPC banner and working for him is a benefit. It benefits his magazines. That benefits the bottom line. Ultimately, that benefits Johnson. So in terms of the names who are on the list, like we can speculate on who is on there. I think I would say Bennett is on there. Hans Massaquoi is possibly on there. These are kind of generally Ebony editors. William Grayson, who's an advertising exec, is probably on there. Ira Bell is on there probably, and a few other people. But I think less so that who's on the list. It's instructive to think about how Johnson understands man management and interacting with people, and how he builds his company. Because there's a lot of people who work for Johnson Publishing who don't like Johnson at all, but they buy into like the broader vision, which I think is super important.
I think that's the most British thing I've heard you say this morning. When I hear you say man management, all I think of is football, baby, and good coaching. Good coaching. Anyway, my bad. Sorry about that. No, sorry. Go ahead, Todd. I had a question, but I lost it with my own football reference.
All right. Well, you know, as you see, James, Dr. Ball is into the football. Okay, so you know he's there.
Yeah,
so
no question. Premier League started, man. I'm telling you. Let's go. Let's get it. Let's get it cracking. I'm saying. Anyway, sorry. Go ahead.
Let me get to another question. So, you know, how does there is one question I had that I think you didn't answer, and by the way, that's a compliment, because I was saying to Dr. Ball in the beginning of this broadcast that a good biographer answers most of the questions you have about a subject. When the reader reads it, they go, okay, now I know, now I know. And what I said to Dr. Ball at the beginning of the broadcast is I understand Bennett a lot because he is not only a college graduate, but he's also a member of a black fraternity that, that's known for certain characteristics, right? That I was able to match to Bennett. But what I always wanted to know, and I read both your books, and I tried to read both your books carefully, and I tried to read Fenderson's book carefully, but I never really understood, why did Bennett never really go to bat for Hoyt Fuller? I mean, Lord knows Hoyt Fuller was doing the Lord's work in terms of the content he was putting out with Black World, and I would have expected a Bennett who was clearly on the list, right, to like go to bat for Hoyt Fuller, even though that might rupture his relationship with Johnson. So I'm interested in terms of what you saw in terms of the archives and your interviews, what your take is on that.
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think it is one of the limitations of my book and my work generally. And I think with my books on Bennett, and particularly the biography that's just come out, like I'm really trying to say, this is a biography of Bennett. It's not like the biography of Bennett. There's a lot of other contextual stuff going on here that I can't get into. Some of that is because, I'm a white British scholar writing on Bennett, and I don't want to speculate on interpersonal relationships without kind of the additional cultural context that other scholars could provide. And I know scholars like Bianna Jeffries, who I believe is at Ohio State, I think she's working on Bennett. Chris Tinson, who wrote a fantastic book about the Liberator magazine, he's done bits on Bennett. So I think those people are better placed in some ways to talk about those specific interpersonal relationships. I mean, the clearest indication that I've had is from an interview with Haki Madhubuti, who's then known as Don Lee, the Black Chicagoan poet. And he talks about Bennett, like knowing Bennett around the time that Hoyt Fuller basically gets fired from Johnson Publishing. And he's like, Bennett's really cut up about it. And it's probably the closest that he's seen Bennett to leaving Johnson Publishing for kind of ideological reasons. Like he's really disillusioned by what happens to Hoyt Fuller. But ultimately, actions speak louder than words. And there's not a whole lot of evidence that I've seen of Bennett, at least publicly, going to bat for Hoyt Fuller. Now, what happens behind the scenes, I don't know. Bennett is, more than most people at Johnson Publishing, is someone who's got Johnson's ear. So it's possible that he's, making the case for Bennett behind the scenes, but I've not seen much publicly, like you say. And it is a mystery because from what I can tell, they have a fairly good relationship. They kind of run in many of the same circles. Bennett, I mean, Hoyt Fuller, I think, is probably a bit further to the left than Bennett. I think that's fair to say. And John Fenderson's book on Hoyt Fuller and the Negro Digest is really great on thinking about Fuller specifically. But I don't.
Let me throw some speculation in here amidst all the scholarship and deep thought. Let me just throw some speculation in here. What I understand off the record about Hoyt Fuller, and now understanding Lerone Bennett as a Kappa, maybe it's some personal competition in these streets. It could be something as petty as you know, you hollered at my girl. You try to get, I mean, seriously, like, I mean, it could be just something as little as that. Cause I think you make a good point. Why wouldn't they have been more on the same team? Anyway.
Yeah.
I have that same question, James, when I look at that Northwestern piece, and I'm really trying to understand what Sterling Stuckey was trying to say. Like, was he trying to say that there's only room for one? You know, like Highlander, there can only be one, or is he really mad at Bennett? You know, trying to bum rush Northwestern. I mean, what do you feel from that in terms of the Stuckey Bennett relationship?
Yeah. Stuckey was an interesting guy. For those who aren't familiar with Sterling Stuckey, I'd recommend doing a Google, finding out a bit more about him. He's a really important figure in terms of African American scholarship, and he's someone who's at Northwestern, and it seems like he's probably one of the main reasons why Bennett runs into conflict with Northwestern, particularly during his ill-fated second stint as the chair of the founding Afro-American Studies department. And I think, like, the argument I make in my book about that, and that's really based off people like John Bracey, who've written so John Bracey is someone who knew both Bennett and Stuckey, and he's written quite candidly on them both. And his take is that Stuckey, I mean, from Stuckey's perspective, I think he does think that Bennett is being autocratic. He's trying to kind of take over the department. And then I think from Bennett's perspective, Bennett is like, you came to me, like you want me to create a bold vision for Black studies at Northwestern. Let me do that. Like, if you believe in me, if you believe in the project of Black studies, that has to be activist. It has to be a radical project. Like, you have to invest in the vision that I have for this project. And I think maybe Stuckey individually and Northwestern as an institution weren't on board with that. And then the idea of Bennett being like quite autocratic or taking control is maybe a bit of like a get out and a way to really avoid addressing some of those underlying issues. And that goes back to really what the debate that's at the heart of the development of Black studies, which is, do you want a Black studies that's sponsored by the Ford Foundation, or do you want a kind of radical community-based, community-focused, activist Black studies? And people like Lawrence Reddick talk about this in the 70s against this broader context, talk about the corporatization of Black studies. And that's kind of the broader milieu. And I think that's really what's informing this specific fight between Sterling Stuckey and Bennett around Northwestern. But again, speculation.
That's good. I want to bring up James Turner now and get your take on him. If I remember correctly, Turner shows up very prominently in both your books, and I think he shows up in two different spaces, if I have this right. He shows up in being one of the founders or founding members of the Institute of the Black World in Atlanta, which is in itself a very fascinating experiment that they've written whole books on. And then he shows up again with Bennett Although I'm saying with Bennett in kind of quotes, because Bennett seemed to be kind of on his own at the 6-pack or 7-pack Pan African conference in Tanzania. So I know that Turner plays a major role in both of those spaces. So I wanted you to talk about what you learned with James Turner, because I know you and Dr. Ball would have a great chat about that.
Yeah, so I'd have to go back and check actually, because I can't. I'm not sure if Turner was involved in the founding of the Institute of Black World, but the Turner, like the main way into Turner in my book is his role at Northwestern, and he plays a really central role in the African American Student Union at Northwestern. And there's a couple of different Black student groups at Northwestern, and there's sit-in, kind of student sit-in in protest of Northwestern's policies towards Black students, and to demand a Black Studies department in '68, I believe. And that's one of the founding reasons why Bennett comes to Northwestern, along with some other Black scholars, as a visiting researcher in that year and then in the subsequent year. So Turner is a graduate student at Northwestern, and there's a really good profile of Turner which appears in 1968 in the Chicago Tribune, which is a good starting point for thinking about his kind of activism, if you like. And so that's the kind of starting point for me in the book, in his relationship with Bennett, or one of the main starting points. And then, yeah, a couple of years later, Turner is one of many people who's involved in Sixth Pan-African Congress. And I think those two moments give us kind of an interesting snapshot into James Turner and his evolution, and then also his relationship to Bennett as well.
So would Turner be considered a fellow traveler of Bennett or a protege? Like, how would you define it?
I think, well, Turner's a good bit younger than Bennett, so I think particularly early on when he's a graduate student, I think Bennett is definitely a kind of mentor to him. I believe Bennett writes one of Turner's letters of recommendation when Turner gets the position at Cornell. I'd have to double check that, but I'm pretty sure I remember a letter from Bennett recommending Turner. So, and then later on they become more kind of colleagues, and it becomes more of a familiar relationship, I think. So it kind of evolves from more of a mentor-mentee relationship into more of a kind of equal relationship.
So Turner so he was a grad student at Northwestern, but was not. But because the Black Studies program that Bennett had put together was undergraduate, he wasn't actually a student in that program. Is that right, or am I getting the timeline wrong?
So Turner is a graduate student at Northwestern at the time that Bennett gets there as a visiting researcher. So he's not. I don't believe he's ever taught by Bennett directly, but they're obviously connected because Bennett has quite a lot to do with the student activist groups at Northwestern. And then quite soon after that, Turner is effectively headhunted by Cornell to head up its own emerging
and more specifically by the students at Cornell. I mean, it wasn't the existing faculty so much. Certainly was not the administration. It was the students who had been involved with the Willard Straight takeover. It was that conference at Howard University that I know Greg Carr has talked a lot about, where Turner's invited. But anyway, so because again, I'm thinking a letter from Bennett would have been a nice recommendation as it related to the students. I don't know that it would have held a lot of weight in terms of the administration, unless the administration was just looking for any sort of support for whoever the students wanted so they could mollify that rebellion. But anyway, yeah, no, Anyway, please go on, or Todd ask, or respond, go ahead. I just wanted to throw that in there very quickly.
I mean, James, if you could tell me what you learned, because what we were talking about before you showed up are the things that you didn't talk about, which you've admitted that as a white British scholar, you may not be the most qualified person to talk about. But I'm still interested because you've gone through the primary source materials in these 2 books, or even 3 books if you want to count in the one about the Black press architecture. What did you learn about, the interaction between all of these people? Because one of the things I pointed out before you came on was that somebody like John Henry Clark today would be jealous of a Lerone Bennett, right? But instead of being jealous of a Lerone Bennett, he celebrates a Lerone Bennett not only privately, but actually writes an article celebrating his work for Freedom Ways, right? And Dr. Ball and I know the context of that. We know that Dr. Clark is writing that article during the day while he's sitting at HARU Act, right, where he has a job, and then after he writes that article, he then has to spend half the night doing the HARU Act work that he couldn't do during the day because he was spending the day writing about Freedom Ways, right? So there are real connections with these people who seem to be not as petty as it would later get. So I wanted to know, in terms of your view of the primary source material, what did you find out about that kind of interaction?
Yeah, I mean, I'll push back a little bit on the comparison with today, just because I think there is a tendency to kind of romanticize some of these earlier relationships. And I think, let's make a case for pettiness as a consistency. So I don't know, I think in some ways, a lot of those relationships between Black scholars, particularly scholars not kind of specifically rooted in the academy in the 50s, 60s, 70s, there are still these kind of tensions and fractures and kind of squabbles and things. But I mean, I think really one of the big differences, and it really kind of starts. So if you think about the emergence of this idea of the Black public intellectual, which kind of really, that term really becomes vogue in the 1990s. People like Cornel West, Henry Louis Gates, etc. And someone like Adolph Reed, who's quite critical of those people, his criticism is in many ways because he sees those type of figures as being insulated or distant from the Black community, more so than people like a Henry Clark or a Bennett, or other people of that earlier period. And a lot of that is because they're kind of institutionalized within the academy. If you think about prominent Black historians today in terms of the media, I would argue that most of them, if not very close to all of them, at least in terms of mainstream media, they're academic historians, right? They're professionally trained academic historians. Many of them work at Ivy League schools or elite research colleges. Whereas someone like Bennett or a John Henrik Clarke, they just have a very different way into that work. And I think that they have maybe a cynicism about the academy more so there. But also,
I think the proper word is suspicion.
Yeah.
They're suspicious of trained historians.
And that's kind of, you see that there's a moment in particularly the 80s with Asala where you start to see this kind of shift from you see the shift towards academically, professionally trained Black historians. And it's funny because a lot of those scholars who grew up on the work of people like Bennett start to both implicitly and explicitly distance themselves from Bennett's work and the work of other popular Black historians. And Darrell Michael Scott is a really good example of that, who was the president of Asala for a period. And he's written, he's written and published, so he's like intentionally talked about this. He's talked about basically when he was growing up, he thought Bennett was the man, but then when he got older, he was like, oh, actually, John Hope Franklin's like the better quote unquote scholar from an academic perspective. And I think that shift is very tied to the kind of professionalization of Black history and of Black studies, and of the relationship that Black historians have or don't have necessarily with Black communities on a day-to-day. And I'm sure there's lots of people who might disagree with that, but I think that's something that Bennett thinks about a lot, because when he moved to Northwestern, like, he seemed quite conflicted about whether he was going to take on a job at Northwestern. And he talked to Vincent Harding, and Vincent Harding was like pretty upset about it, because Vincent Harding was like, why aren't you taking a job at a Black college? Like, why are you working at Northwestern? But, you know, to the day he died, Bennett was very proud of, like, always working for a Black company. Like, he worked, so he was educated at Morehouse. He went straight from Morehouse to work at the Atlanta World, which is one of the very few Black daily papers in the country. And then he went from there to Johnson Publishing, and he stayed at Johnson Publishing. Yeah.
I don't disagree with what you said. I think it's interesting that this is sort of the point I was making about the comparison between Bennett and Franklin earlier, that I agree. I think there has been a professionalization of the fields, and which is another way of saying a change of your audience that you're targeting, where the target audience goes from a Black working class community to a white, if not academic affluent audience, or certainly a white funding academic audience. But where I see some contradiction and even similarity is that, yes, Bennett may have worked for Johnson Publishing, but ultimately Johnson Publishing is a conduit for white advertising money. So it's not it's not as insulated as he may have thought at the time, though he had probably more, room to work with that. I think, by the way, since Turner has been evoked, I mean, going back even to my recent interview with Dr. Carol Boyce Davies on the subject, or not on this subject, but where she brought this up in our discussion, the trajectory of the Africana Studies and Research Center at Cornell has followed the path, I think you, Dr. West, that you are outlining here. The professionalization and sort of retargeting of the focus from the Black community to the administration at Cornell, and even honestly, even one of the early criticisms I remember, I believe it, Kamosi Woodard's book, one of his books, was that even early on, that the Africana Studies and Research Center, even under Dr. Turner, had not been able to sustain its initial focus, in particular, as Woodard's pointed out, its connection to the community, the specific work happening in the community, which I thought had as much to do with funding, administrative interruptions, trying to defend and protect the institution, and trying to impart certain politics on a constantly, circulating new crop of students, but the point still remains that an attempt to maintain a focus on the community is hard. It's difficult. It's certainly not encouraged. Anyway, please respond, or Todd, go ahead with you.
I'm really glad you brought the advertising up, because I think that it's like such an important point, and it's always like you have to think about it, because it does. In certain instances, we have clear examples where it does affect advertising policy, and it actually feeds into the departure of Hoyt Fuller, because of what he starts writing around, like, Middle Eastern politics in Negro Digest, or Black World, as it was then known. So yes, the advertising is massive, and the advertising is something that Bennett, you get snippets about Bennett, and he doesn't seem like super happy about the advertising. But I think the way that he describes himself which I think is super, super interesting because it's almost using that corporate language, is that he describes himself as a franchise within Johnson Publishing. So he understands his role. Like he's basically like the Black History franchise. So he's like, there's a lot of stuff that goes on in this company that I don't agree with, but ultimately, like, is this role going to give me the best opportunity to reach the most amount of Black people in the way that I want?
Would you point out repeatedly in the book, in the biography, is that even the community starts to divide. Well, there's Lerone Bennett, and then there's Ebony, right? But James, I think it's important for Dr. Ball and the audience, because I put this in the article I wrote a couple of years ago about your other book, but I want you to talk about this directly. When it comes to the advertising, you point out a very specific contradiction that happens around the bicentennial with what Johnson's focus is and the future of Ebony, and really the future of how Black America views history, to what Bennett says about the bicentennial. And I want you to talk about a little bit of that, because that points up, like Johnson at some point had gotten tired of the tension, right? He had gotten tired of, well, I'm this capitalist who has had all this radical stuff in my magazines for 10 years. There actually becomes a real marking point that you even see in the articles about Ebony. So I want you to point out that contradictory period of 1976 and what happened between Johnson and Bennett, and even some of the articles in Ebony.
Yeah, definitely. So that's the bicentennial, and for people like Ebony is fully available on Google Books, and you can search it. And I'd really recommend going and having a look at some of the advertising that starts to appear around the bicentennial in the mid 70s. And a project that I'm working on at the moment really focuses on the Black history advertising in Ebony. So it looks at the ways in which these big corporations start to use Black history as an advertising strategy effectively. And I'm sure a lot of people listening they probably saw one of the Budweiser Anheuser-Busch Great Kings of Africa posters in their school, or they probably maybe had one at home, or their father had one of like the beer mirrors. So we're
at our local liquor store too.
Yeah. So yeah, we're all kind of familiar with that, the role that corporations have in shaping Black history. And Ebony is an interesting space to see how that happens. But yeah, Todd, as you say, for Bennett, some of Bennett's most explicit criticism of Ebony and of Johnson Publishing comes around the bicentennial. And in the bicentennial special issue, which is August 1975, they basically have a three-parter where they ask people, like, should African Americans celebrate the bicentennial? And Bennett's response is an adamant no. And then he maps out why. And he talks about the essential schizophrenia of American life. Why do Americans make a practice of unfreedom and a profession of praising freedom? Why do they go out of their way to call attention to themselves by publicly professing what they are not doing, have never done, and have no intention of doing? And he's really just taking aim at the kind of hypocrisy and contradictions of the bicentennial. And as part of that, he explicitly takes aim at like Black consumerism. And of course, Ebony is one of the great vehicles for consumerism within Black communities. So Bennett has this fantastic quote. He says, the issue is not whether the Blacks of 1975 consume more calories than the Blacks of 1775. The issue is not whether we have more Cadillacs than the cocoa farmers of Ghana. The issue is freedom. And this is one of the most explicit criticisms of kind of the Ebony ethos, if you like, that Bennett publishes in Ebony, at least. And as you say, Todd, I think it's important that it's coming around the bicentennial, because this is a moment where a lot of these things start to really converge, which is, Bennett's dissatisfaction with aspects of Johnson Publishing, and then the kind of increased corporate investment in Black history, and then Bennett's understanding that actually his role at Ebony in some ways has facilitated this.
Well, let's talk about what you say specifically, because I loved in the other book the contradiction you point out, and Dr. Ball, you'll love this in terms of media hegemony. Check this out. I write about this on Dr. Ball's site, but for those who haven't read the article, Bennett comes out and openly says the bicentennial is useless to black people and that it is ridiculous for black people to celebrate the bicentennial, like a very decolonized, right, statement. That's somebody coming out of Pac 6, coming out of, right, Hoyt Fuller, all that. He's clearly coming out of that, right? But what you point out specifically is that Johnson discovers this gold mine and realizes, okay, like I don't have to have all these articles about black history, about Lerone, about Abraham Lincoln being a white supremacist and all of that. When I can start promoting these heritage tours, this is when these heritage tours starts coming out. Now, not coincidentally, and this is where I want to point this out. Not coincidentally, there's another black writer who is in New York and who's been speaking and speaking about he found his great 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 ancestor, and Ozzie Davis and Ruby Dee hear one of these stories, and they call up their friend David Wolper, the white producer, and said, "Oh, you got to get this guy, right?" And so it's not coincidental that this is when Roots, Alex Haley, right? Who we just talked about earlier. We talked about the tradition of being on those ships and being in the Coast Guard and writing and reading all that. We talked about that earlier before you came in. So this is where Alex Haley, who's already done the autobiography of Malcolm X, right? So he's established himself as a superior narrator. Notice I'm saying narrator, and storyteller. Notice I'm saying storyteller of Black history. So it's not coincidental that this is where you get the emergence of Haley and this completely toothless Black history, right? Like, because what did the joke that the activist said, that Alex Haley is the only person who can be a Christian and an integrationist, and he can go to Africa, he can find his religion, he can find his name, he can find everything, and then goes right back to being right a Christian. Now, of course, we know with Alex Haley that he made all that stuff up. So I mean, so he didn't have any psychological torture over this. He made all that stuff up. But the point I'm making is that all of this is happening at the same time. And what I want to point out is, and you were brilliant in doing this, while all of this is happening, Johnson commissions an article called "Where Are the Black Revolutionaries?" And so talk about the timing of all of this stuff together, because you had in your other book, you made it very clear that the timing, if not organized, is definitely suspect of how all of this was happening in Johnson Publications at the same time. So talk about that article and talk about the timing of it in connection with the tours and all the other stuff.
Yeah.
Forgive me, I gotta interrupt quickly, James, before you start, because we've gone long this morning. We're cutting into the premiere of the Free Mutulu Shakur segment of the Asada Chant series that our channel is promoting, some work of some comrades in commemoration of Black August. So if you're here now, please stay and then go check that out later. If you leave and go check that out now, please come back. I don't really care which is which, as long as you see everything and support everything and check everything whenever you get to it is great. But I just want to make a note that is happening now. It's that next episode is premiering, and it is part of a series that started last week, Asada's Chant. So please go check that either now or later, but eventually. Sorry, James, go ahead. Please go ahead.
No, thanks for flagging that up. Yeah, I think, Todd, as you say, there's a lot of these things converging. And then one other thing that's quite important that I'd add into that is the formal federal recognition of the expansion of what was Negro History Week into Black History Month, which really is happening, I think, 75. So again, it's kind of all within this period. And I think there's a very intentional shift. And like, for me, I would argue that these things are all connected. So the massive flow of white corporate money into the emerging field of Black studies, and the role of things like the Ford Foundation, I think that's parallel to the flow of money from white corporations into advertising and Black heritage and this idea of Black history tourism that's happening into the mid 70s. And then also at Johnson Publishing, you see a reframing of the company's politics, or a recentering of maybe the stuff that came earlier, because you see this moment of this almost this high point in the late 60s, early 70s, where the magazine Ebony, and then also particularly Black World, you see Johnson Publishing as a really interesting space for Black radical politics. And for Ebony, maybe the high point of that is their 1969 special on the Black Revolution. And if you look at let me see if I can get it up. You look at the list of the contributors to that 1969 special, and it's something.
Well, while you're looking that list up, I want to talk about the three main contributions that Ebony makes to Black America, which I think are significant. I've already mentioned one, which is the hiring of 3 Pan-Africanists, and those are Hoyt Fuller, Arabelle Thompson, and Lerone Bennett. The other 2 major contributions that Ebony made was they covered the civil rights movement extensively, particularly Jet magazine, which, we kind of joke about Jet magazine with, that magazine that just has the beauty in it on page 34 or whatever, right? But they were actually doing something other than that, right? But Jet was in every liquor store and every barbershop in Black America, right? But Jet had extensive coverage of the civil rights movement. You can't be a major civil rights historian without quoting Jet, right? But the third thing they did, and I think this is also very important, because it's been in the news recently, is that until Johnson sold it, or whatever you want to call, he did it with the Blacksonian and Google or whatever. Until that family did that, Johnson was the largest private owner of Black photographs in the United States, if not the world. And he did that not only because he had these amazing Black photographers, but James, you know this as a Chicago media historian, both Johnson and Hugh Hefner, one of the things that they have in common, and you wouldn't think we put both of those in a sentence, right? But one of the things they have in common is that they succeeded at their model magazines when other people who tried to do the exact same thing failed. And what Johnson and Hugh Hefner would do is that when a magazine failed, they would swoop in and buy all of the archives, including all of the photos of these failed magazines. So Johnson has this huge photo collection. And by the way, he gets one of his photographers this way from one of these failed magazines. Hans Massaquoi, I'm sure I'm mispronouncing his name, but that's the brother who takes the picture of Coretta Scott King with Bernice on her lap at the funeral that wins a Pulitzer Prize, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, talking about Hugh Hefner, it's also important that I bring him in, and I'm going to tell you why I'm going to bring him in a minute. Hugh Hefner swoops in and buys all of this material from these other magazines who fail, right? And so one of the things that Hugh Hefner buys is he buys some sort of sports magazine, right? And he finds these tapes, these cassette tapes. And he finds out that some guy was crazy enough to interview Miles Davis, and not only interview Miles Davis, but to actually put on the boxing gloves and go and box with Miles Davis, right? And this interview was never used because Miles, instead of talking about music and sports, because Miles was heavily into sports, he also talks a lot about racism. And so Hefner is like, this is a pretty good interview. I think I'm going to call this guy up who did this interview and ask him to go and interview Miles again and finish it. And the guy he calls is Alex Haley. And that's where we get the first Playboy interview, because Hefner swooped in and found this interview literally in the refuge of this failed magazine. And because of Haley's success with the Playboy interview, he interviews Miles Davis, he interviews Norman Lincoln Rockwell, the head of the American Nazi Party, and then he interviews Malcolm. And as a result of the interview of Malcolm, that's how we get the autobiography of Malcolm X. So these magazines, I mean, they're dinosaurs now, but these magazines played major roles in American culture. And so, James, while you were looking that up, I mean, you feel free to comment on that, and then show us what you were looking up. But I wanted to make that point because that's an important historical point to make in the middle of the 20th century. Because remember, audience, not only is there no internet, there's not even really broadcasting that's actually stepping in to fill these. Broadcasting hasn't filled in these gaps yet. Broadcasting is still DJing and music and things like that. So these magazines play an extremely important role in the development of the middle of the American century. So I just wanted to say that. And if you want to comment on that, James, go ahead.
Yeah, definitely. So yeah, Hugh Hefner is another interesting dude. He invests in Essence magazine early on. He's one of, I don't know if he's one of the founding investors in Essence magazine, but he has like a pretty important role early on in Essence.
I thought Johnson did that, not Hefner. Hefner did that too.
They both do, yeah.
They both did.
Yeah.
That I didn't know.
So yeah, because I think it's Ed Lewis talks about it in autobiography. But yeah, I think this is, and it's great that you mentioned the photography collection as well. Yeah, I don't think it's an overstatement to say that the Johnson Publishing Photo Archives is probably the single most significant visual archive of 20th century Black life. I don't think it's particularly close. Like the scale of that archive is staggering. And just recently, like the last couple of weeks, it's been announced that that photo archive was initially bought by a consortium of kind of institutions, and then it's been formally donated to the National Museum of African American History and Culture by Getty, I think. So yeah, they're in the process of archiving it right now. But yeah, so just to flag up, I mean, for anyone listening who's not familiar, just have a quick Google of the Johnson Publishing Photo Archive. And
wait a minute. Wait, are you saying that Getty is in control of that archive?
So Getty, and I want to make sure I don't get this wrong. Like, my understanding is that Getty was part of the consortium that bought the archive, but that the Johnson Publishing Photo Archive just recently, in the past couple of weeks, has been formally transferred to, like, so Getty has committed money to digitizing it, but now the control is transferring to the National Museum of African American History and Culture.
So Getty is doing a solid for the Blacksonian, that's what you're saying.
Well, I mean, I think that's maybe a bit optimistic or generous.
I was about to say, that sounds more like they're doing themselves a solid by becoming the middlemen of all the whatever is generated from those images.
I'm not surprised.
And to hear when Professor West is saying, I forgot exactly your wording, but the most significant or substantial archive of Black life in the 20th century is now a Getty property. I'm not thrilled with that. And I'm no fan of museums either. So even this African-American one. So, but that's a whole other
one of your co-hosts call it the Oprah Winfrey African-American Museum?
Somebody did.
One of your co-hosts called it the Oprah Winfrey.
I think so. Somebody probably said something like that. But I just, it's always concerning where, but anyway, but that was just a passing.
But James,
aside.
did you call up what you wanted to show us? You were calling something up.
Yeah. So it was just going back to the Black Revolution special in Ebony in '69. Just on the official announcement in terms of the Getty Trust is that they've committed $30 million to digitize the archive, which is more than 4 million prints and negatives. And then the official transfer of ownership has now gone to the Smithsonian.
Boy, talk about one for you and one for me. Getty's going to have a great time going one for you, one for me as they do that.
And the Smithsonian, anyway, whatever. Okay.
Now, this is Dr. Ball's show, but I did take a peek into the chat, and Leah Boggs wants to know, why did you go on this journey? I mean, she's very interested in how you became interested in the Black press and in Chicago. Yeah,
it's a fair and question for not just a white British scholar, but someone who's like aggressively white. So I think it is probably a fair question. I'm just going to quickly run through the list of names on the special issue from the Black Revolution. So you got Bennett leading it off, Charles Hamilton, Larry Neal, Don Bogle, Dave Lawrence, A.B. Spellman, Tom and Boyer, Bayard Rustin, Huey Newton, Peter Bailey, Charles Sanders, James Turner, Vincent Harding, Alex Poinsett, John Conyers, Phil Garland, and a few other people.
That's a hell of a list.
Yeah, and that's in Ebony.
Right,
So,
right.
You know, that kind of gives you a sense of
Right.
what's going on.
That is a hell of a list, and if I, you know, it's all men too, right?
No, Phil Garland, right?
Phil Garland,
Phil Garland, pioneering Black journalists.
But it is a fair point, and
that.
Also the cover, the coverage in general, like it's very gendered. Like the cover of that issue is basically just a illustration of a black man, and I think it's important that you bring that up.
Shirley has a little warning for you over here on this side of the pond, Professor West, in terms of your aggressively white self-description.
Right.
You got to be careful how that reads over here.
Right.
That might.
Yeah, I'm talking exclusively in terms of my milk complexion.
Right.
So I'm like basically translucent at this point.
James, no, I can tell you spend time in archives, man, because England is baking, man. You should be baked. You know, but you're not in England right now. You're in DC, right?
Yeah, I'm in DC, but still lacking in vitamin D, unfortunately.
Right.
That's funny.
So tell us about this journey that you've taken to all of this.
Yeah, sure. So I think, the first thing I will say is that there's no way that I would end up writing these books without kind of the support and guidance of like specific people, particularly within the context of Black Chicago, like archivists in particular. So Aisha Hakel, who was at Chicago State, Raquel Flores Clemens, who was at Chicago State. Like those two people are really, really important. And I just wanted to like shout them out by name to start off with. Like my entry point into Ebony was really looking at coverage of James Brown. It's early on in my academic career, I wrote a piece on James Brown and his role as a Black capitalist, and I was interested in his advertising in Ebony and Johnson Publishing. And then that just became a kind of gateway into thinking about Johnson Publishing, and I started becoming interested in the magazines around the time that they started being digitized by Google. So it was all just very accessible. And I think, you can think a lot of different things about Johnson Publishing. I'm sure we all have opinions, but if nothing else, it is an extraordinary snapshot into Black life and culture at a particular moment in American history. And,
absolutely.
And the more I read Ebony, the more I was kind of like, this guy Bennett, he seems really interesting. And the kind of stuff that he's writing doesn't really seem like it necessarily goes with a lot of this other stuff. And how does that work? Like you've got this interview with like a Black celebrity and his photos of their home. And then you've got like Abe Lincoln was a white supremacist. And I'm like,
right.
Like how do these things go together? And then I became connected to the Bennett family, and in particular Joy Bennett, who is Bennett's eldest daughter. And Joy has just been a wonderful supporter and kind of now someone who I'm very grateful to count as a friend. And she kind of encouraged my interest in Bennett. And then also just circumstance happened that the moment that I was becoming more interested in Bennett, two unprocessed collections of his papers kind of became not available because they weren't like publicly accessible, but I was able to get like access to them. And one of those was at Emory University. And then one of those was at Chicago State University. So that's the kind of way in which I got interested in Bennett specifically. And again, Aisha and Raquel at Chicago State, I do just want to like flag them up because for the Chicago State collections in particular, they were just super, like I wouldn't have been able to do the biography without their help in looking through those collections.
Well, I mean, congratulations and everything. Dr. Ball, I have a final comment that I'll make at like 10:44, but I'm happy to let the chat ask him questions and you to do questions between now and then.
Yeah, I don't see any particular questions. If anybody has one that they want, please ask it or repost it. And I'm just appreciative, not having read it yet, but I appreciate that the work, James West, and you coming through and talking a little bit about it this morning. Definitely appreciate that.
Well, just in case there's some
yeah,
reposting, I'll ask a quick question.
No, go ahead.
Haki Manabuti must have had a very complex relationship with Johnson Publishing. Now, I know that he kind of owed Johnson Publishing because the first major article, he talks about the first major article he ever got. And I mean, they wrote a major article on him when he was Don L. Lee back in the late 60s. And James, I just want to interrupt my own question to say, all of Ebony, Jet, Black World, Negro Digest, all of it is online, right? Is that correct?
So not all of it. So it is online, but not all in the same place. So okay. Ebony, Jet, Negro Digest, Black World, like most of that is available through Google Books, and that's colorized and searchable up until about 2008. And then the earlier editions of Negro Digest and Black World are available, but they're a bit harder to find. The best place to find those is archive.org. And then you can look at them as like PDFs and stuff. So yeah, it's kind of a bit split.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, some of this stuff is just getting online. I didn't know until recently that Freedom Ways is all online. So I mean, it's getting there. But to go back to Haki, I mean, so like I said, Haki kind of owes Johnson Publications, but I mean, his own black nationalists and working class tendencies, I mean, they had to have some sort of like conflict or something, even if it's subtle. I mean, could you talk about what Haki told you about, his relationship with Johnson and Bennett and the people at Ebony and Jet?
Yeah, so I didn't talk to Haki directly. Like the stuff that I got on his relationship, I got through interviews that he'd done, and he's been very open about talking about Johnson Publishing over the years, so that was fine. He has this big profile in Ebony. He's also like at the front of the picket line when local activists are picketing the Johnson Publishing headquarters to protest like editorial policy. So I don't think he cares what Johnson Publishing thinks of him that much, and I think he tells Johnson as much. And he has his own publishing stuff going on with Third World Press, and he's someone who, I couldn't ever imagine him working for Johnson Publishing in a more formal capacity in the way that someone like Hoyt Fuller or Bennett did. Like he knows those guys and he's friendly with those guys, but I don't think that him and Johnson would kind of, on a day-to-day, I don't think that would work. But he's very happy to like utilize the reach and take the press. But yeah, I think he's quite open in being critical, particularly of Ebony. I don't think he has any issues in being critical where he believes, or not even. I don't think he would necessarily even see it as being critical, but it's just like trying to hold these outlets accountable to the Black community. Like he understands that Johnson Publishing could be a force for tremendous good, but often it might not be, in his opinion. So I think he's very vocal in saying what he thinks the magazines could do better, to be invested in and accountable to the Black community.
Well, James, you've done the impossible. You have worn me out. I don't have any questions about Ebony and Jet pretty much left. So, Dr. Ball, anything from the chat?
No, not that I've seen. Oh, well, hold on a second. What is this? From Ricky. Talks about, let's see, the other Blacklist book talks about Chicago's history with producing the solid Black cultural stuff. Could it be argued that the media environment in Chicago existed to combat that? There was, just quickly before either of you answer this, there was an article I read. Oh man, I remember it was part of the research I was doing for the Buying Power book, and it was talking about. I think it was even a review of a book that I have not read about Chicago's media history, and but the article made a point similar to what I think Ricky is raising here, that the media environment in Chicago was evolved specifically to do what it always is to promote Black capitalism in terms of Black community work, and to be a negation of any developing radical media or journalistic production or academic production. But anyway, if I understood Ricky's question, that's my quick 2 cents on it. Do either of you have something you'd like to add or contribute or respond?
So on I believe they're talking about, so the book is Mary Washington's book, I think.
Okay.
Correct me if I'm not wrong. I think it came out maybe like eight years ago or something like that. But yeah, like talking basically about the Black cultural left in the 30s and the 40s, and then so I think there is a kind of transition, and you see this transition from kind of the Black cultural front of the interwar and World War II era into what comes afterwards, into the kind of Johnson Publishing era, if you like. And I think it's fair to make the case that in some ways Johnson Publishing kind of takes energy away from the Black left or redirects it into more like moderate or consumerist ambitions. But also I think a lot of the people who are connected to that earlier like period of the Black left in Chicago, like are still heavily involved in Johnson Publishing later on. So like, you know, Gwendolyn Brooks, Alan Morrison, those type of people, that you can kind of chart a through line from that earlier period into the post-war era and their relationship to stuff like Johnson Publishing. So I think in some ways, yeah, Johnson Publishing, it's not like as a whole, it's not a radical organization, of course not. The magazines are consumer magazines. You're not going to get a Black left perspective in there. You know, this isn't like Paul Robeson's Freedom. But I think in some ways they do provide a little bit of space for some of those figures to kind of continue their work. And Johnson Publishing just as an institution becomes a kind of connective tissue that binds a lot of these ideological factions within Black Chicago together in I think a way that's quite interesting.
Right on. I don't see any other questions in the chat. Professor James West, I definitely want to thank you for your work and for coming through this morning. I have to catch up on reading it myself, and perhaps doing this again at some point. And Dr. Todd Stephen Burroughs, thank you very much for coming through and positively taking over the program this morning.
Thank you. I just want to say something really, really quick.
Yeah, sure.
James did us a great service by showing that Bennett early on said he was trying to get words to save his life. That's a direct quote. This is in the tradition of what 20th century writers and orators say. Who has said something similar to that? Baldwin, Frederick Douglass, August Wilson. See, again, you see that continuity, right? In which people are trying to save their lives and then trying to save other people's lives through words, and not what we have now, which is a lot of positioning and marketing. And I just wanted to make that point. I think it's a point that we're talking about James Turner as well, that's what he was trying to do. So I just wanted to say thank you, Dr. Ball, for this incredible, what is this, 2.5 hours? Two and 3/4 hours, almost 3 hours?
Almost 3 hours.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, and me too. Yeah. Thanks, Ricky, and everybody. Listen, Dr. West. I'm gonna say goodbye to you now because there's a question that was directed at me that I want to respond to, but I don't want to tarnish your reputation by having you on screen when I say what I'm going to say. So I just bid you adieu. Thank you very much, and peace be to you and continue good work, and good luck surviving you in the belly of the beast now.
Yeah,
welcome,
I appreciate
welcome to
it.
DC.
And I don't really care if people buy my book or not. That's not really the function of it. I think just like to follow up on Todd's point, like just please, read Bennett, read Vincent Harding, read James Turner, read these figures, and think about their relationship to that history and to that work.
And to that last point, shout out to my man Scott Brown, who reminds us that Dr. Turner wrote. Like he doesn't get enough credit for what he wrote, for myself included, because I came up with him on lecture tapes. But I'll talk about that for Friday anyway. But thank you very much, Professor West. I'll catch you at another time, and good luck with the work you continue to do. Appreciate you.
Thank you, Dr. West.
All right, Dr. Burroughs. Your reputation is already ruined, so I'll keep you here for a couple seconds.
Let's see what's going on.
I first of all, I want to welcome Iapo Yapa. I don't know exactly when they joined the channel, but appreciate you coming through and becoming a member. Definitely check the debate between Touré and Asante. It's a classic, and shout out to Dr. Kemet Shockley for being one of the organizers at the University of Cincinnati. And the debate was Afrocentricity versus scientific socialism, which is the best way to Pan-Africanism and liberation.
That's a very good one.
And I show it every year to my Black Studies classes now. And I have to say, despite my own biases for Touré, my students overwhelmingly select Asante when they pick a winner for that. And then we have a semester-long debate, because I always show it at the beginning of the semester, and I just debate them the rest of it. But Dr. Todd, Stephen Burroughs, I would love to hear your thoughts on the transformation of Armand White since his City Sundays.
Oh no. I'll tell you this, Joe. When I called Utrice Lee, remember I told you I had a crush on Utrice Lee, and I called Utrice Lee. I think I called her another time and asked her, like, okay, I don't understand this guy Armand White. Like, what is he trying to write? Because he was writing these long pieces for the City Sun about Black culture, but they always kind of turned into a discussion of David Byrne and the Talking Heads, and I didn't know anything about David Byrne and the Talking Heads, so like I didn't understand these long things he was writing, and her response was, well, maybe you need to talk to him about that, which I never did. I never forgot that Armand White said during the Public Enemy, controversy with Professor Griff. Armand White wrote in the City Sun that this is, quote, the worst example of sellout I've seen in my lifetime, end quote. Which shows how.
Wait, they said of Public Enemy that they sold out?
Yes, Armand White said the dumping of Griff was, quote, the worst example of sellout I've seen in my lifetime. Yeah, the City Sun was strong, man. I'm telling you.
Hey,
that's a publication that needs to be on Google and all of that.
I'm not mad at that conclusion.
No, man.
I mean, wow. I'm shocked.
That Armand White, I understood.
All right. So just very quickly, I know, Obi, this was in response to me saying that honorary doctorates, that's why they're called honorary doctorates. A PhD is a doctor of philosophy. The doctorate that they give is an ED, a doctor of education, which is admittedly within the academic world, myself included, at least one full step below.
Yeah, that's true.
At least
that's
one
true.
full step below.
That's true.
So they're not handing out PhDs.
That's true. We're not doing clear. That. It's just true.
I worked for that joint. I know I thought it was easier than Africana, but I worked anyway.
It's just true. Okay. All right. That's right.
All right. So this was the question. This was the comment that I saw that I didn't want to just quickly, because I did get called into a faculty meeting at 11 o'clock.
Sure.
Shout out to Morgan State University. The white academic from whom I learned about Lerone Bennet happened to also write a review of Dr. Ball's I Mix What I Like book for Words, Beats, and Life publication. And then Sounds of St. Elsewhere asked, what did I think about that? I had a lot of thoughts about
I
that.
bet you did. I bet you did.
So, and shout out to Mazi Mutafa, who runs Words Beats in Life. And we've talked about this, and we've gotten pretty good at this point. We had lunch a couple months ago. So we but I was hot, and I'm not going to front. I was not happy, and I was not happy for a number of reasons. Not because the review was critical, but because I was because Todd, you know me, I was like, please just say it publicly. Right. I don't care what you say. Just say it.
Spell my name right, get my argument right, and say whatever you want.
Thank you.
Right.
That's right.
Right.
But what had me hot was that the review only came after I had reached out to Mazi and the crew and was like, basically, what the fuck? I co-founded this damn journal. Literally, like Dr. Clark said of the of Malcolm and OAAU on the floor of my unfinished basement in Northeast DC. Me, Mazi, Sister Amani Bilal, we put that shit together. And I was an unpaid contributor to Words Beats in Life for years. Finally put the book out. It's obviously not going to be, well received and blah, 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 blah. I was like, at least here, somebody's going to review it. And what got me to respond was I said, you all did a positive review of another one of Michael Eric Dyson's books, despite him he's going to be talked about everywhere. And I can't get a review in this journal. And then they come out and they get this dude to review it, and he shits all over the book or whatever. And I was like, all right, that's all right. So I was not happy. I'm not going to front.
Did you remember that was this guy at the time?
Oh, no, I knew exactly, because I didn't know who Saucier. I knew he had written about something in hip hop, but I didn't really know who he was. So on one part, but I didn't really, honestly, the fact that I didn't know him or didn't like that he didn't love the book, because I'm also very self-critical of the book, wasn't the issue. The issue was, why do I have to raise my hand to get my own crew to say something? So I was, and I still am a little bit, but so that's what I thought. That's what I thought.
Dr. Barr, I know your life. You've had to raise your hand for many things you've not had to raise your hand for, and all I can do is pray and say that I hope the future won't match the past. That's what I
Look, well, in all seriousness, I do often get into my own little feelings, but the reality is, in the work that you do and the work that we were just talking about, and then obviously when we're considering the giant that just passed, it does actually selfishly help to be reminded that if a super giant, if super giants, gotta have someone raise their hand for them because they're no longer here to do it, then I get it. But nonetheless, that is what I thought. That is how I feel. So it is what it is. But and yeah, Big Teal, in them unfinished basements on that DC cold cement floor, putting that stuff together anyway.
And what else happens in rooms quietly, right? OAAU charters are written quietly, right? Like we know this education quote that everybody conservative likes to use about Malcolm X. We know John Henry Clark wrote that book, that quote on education. Paul Lee taught me that, right? So I mean, all these things that are done in closets and rooms and living rooms and all of that, that changed the world.
Well, and also don't need. That's why I still have the clip at the end of Wag the Dog. I'm Dustin Hoffman. I'm the one getting taken out to the limo to get a bullet in the head because I want credit. When you're not supposed to want the credit. Dustin Hoffman is like, I did this. And De Niro got to look at the black agent and shake his head, and then you see that, and then Dustin has a heart attack. And I'm like, but I get it. I'm dying on, I want that credit. But the point is, that's the point. And the work that we do, we often don't and shouldn't really need the credit. And it doesn't always matter. But in that moment, that's where I was. I was in my own. So Dr. Burroughs, anytime, man, that you're ready to take over the show, you're welcome. I'm always trying to get it to happen. I thank you very much for doing this. Look forward to your continued contribution to this show, and then also to the other work that you are out here doing. Please do share the link for the upcoming book launch party that you're having.
As soon as they post it out, I'll send it to you for you can talk about it on Remix Morning Show or whenever you can. But I just wanted to thank you. I wanted to thank the chat. I mean, I know I'm on here a lot, so like I don't want to overstay my welcome. So I really appreciate the time you guys allowed me to spend with you, and thank you all of you.
All right. Well, to you and to Dr. West and everybody in the chat, those who will see this later, peace, because we know you're willing to fight for it. Like Fred Hampton used to say, catch you next time here.
I mix what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like.